kembali di hari kedua dari acara kita, AIFIS-RISTEK BRIN Academic Writing Workshop. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you this evening, waktu Indonesia Barat, and in the morning, Eastern Time in the United States. Saya perkenalkan sekali lagi, saya adalah Neta Anggia, Direktur Eksekutif dari American Institute for Indonesian Studies, or AIFIS, mengikuti meeting ini dari kantor kami di Ithaca, New York, dan juga di Jakarta, Indonesia. AIFIS has been organizing academic writing workshops with generous support from the Henry Luce Foundation. We also appreciate the support of our collaborative partners, Universitas Indonesia, Universitas Gajah Mada, dan Universitas Atmajaya, for co-hosting the previous workshops with us. This year, we are honored to organize the first virtual workshop in partnership with the Indonesian Ministry for Research and Technology, the National Agency for Research and Innovation, or Kementerian Riset dan Teknologi Badan Riset dan Inovasi Nasional Republik Indonesia. I'd like to welcome and introduce you to our distinguished speakers, facilitators, Professor Siddharth Chandra, and later who will be joining us, Dr. Paul Kratoska, as well as our moderator for today, Ibu Dr. Ika Nurhayani. Professor Siddharth Chandra is Director of the Asian Studies Center, Professor of Economics at James Madison College of Michigan State University, and Professor by courtesy at the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, Michigan State University. He is also the president of the American Institute for Indonesian Studies. He has been published and cited in numerous publications and has extensive experience in publishing internationally and in mentoring junior, mid-career, and senior scholars. His research has appeared in a variety of journals across the disciplines, including American Psychologist, Emerging Infectious Diseases, Demography, Drug and Alcohol Dependence, Nicotine and Tobacco Research, the International Journal of Drug Policy, the Journal of Regional Science, the Journal of Economic History, World Politics, the British Journal of Political Science, and the Journal of Asian Studies. Dr. Paul Kratoska is Publishing Director and formerly Director of NUS Press at the National University of Singapore. He served on the board of directors of the U.S. Association for Asian Studies from 2003 to 2005 and is past editor of the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies and current editor of the Journal of the Malaysian branch of the Royal Asiatic Society. He taught at the Ateneo de Manila from 1975 to 1977, University Science Malaysia from 1977 to 1987, and the National University of Singapore from 1987 to 2005. His research focuses on Southeast Asia, and he has published books and articles on the Japanese occupation, the history of rice cultivation, ethnic minorities, school textbooks, and academic publishing. He was a contributor to the Cambridge History of Southeast Asia, the Cambridge History of World War II, and the Routledge Handbook of Southeast Asian History, and serves on the boards of the International Journal of Asian Studies of the University of Tokyo, Southeast Asian Studies, EAS Kyoto University, Trans-Regional and National Studies of Southeast Asia, Sogang University, and the Journal of History of the Philippine Historical Society. He is also the lead mentor for the U.S. Social Science Research Council's Global Scholars Initiative. We are honored that Professor Chandra and Dr. Kratoska are here with us today, and we are pleased to have Ibu Dr. Ika Nurhayani to be our moderator for the discussion and Q&A session. Dr. Ika Nurhayani is the head of the Linguistics Graduate Program in the Faculty of Cultural Studies of University of Brawijaya. Before we begin our session, I'd like to remind everyone to please use the Q&A function to ask questions. Mohon mempergunakan fungsi Q&A saat bertanya. We will disable the chat function during the lectures. Jadi chat function akan di-disabled, hanya Q&A function yang akan di-enable. For those of you who are viewing the workshop through the live streams on Facebook and YouTube, please write your questions in the comment section. Please also note that the entire workshop sessions will be recorded And please mention your name and university or institutional affiliations when asking questions. Mohon cantumkan nama jelas Anda beserta afiliasi akademik atau institusional Anda saat mencantumkan pertanyaan. Without further ado, I'd like to invite my colleague and our session moderator, Ibu Dr. Ika Nurhayani, to please lead the first lecture session for today. Ibu Ika, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the time, Ibu Neta. The first session will be presented by Dr. Siddharth Chandra, and then Dr. Paul Kratuska will follow with his presentation. The two presentations will last from 7 to 9 p.m. and then followed by a Q&A. Without further ado, let us welcome the presentation from our distinguished speaker, Dr. Siddharth Chandra. Dr. Chandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ibu Dr. Ika Nurhayani, and thank you, Neta Angia, for that kind introduction. So the plan for today is to cover a few different topics. They are all related to the process of publishing in academic journals. The first two relate to referee reports and the review process. And the third part of this presentation will relate to picking a journal. I bring a slightly different perspective from Dr. Paul Kratoska. Dr. Kratoska is more in the publishing area, academic publishing area. So his work covers more areas of editorial content. He's an editor of a journal. He's been working with the NUS Press, as you heard in the introduction. So the perspective that you got yesterday was the perspective of somebody who's on the publishing side. The perspective that I'm going to give today is one that is perhaps a little bit similar to your own perspective, and that is the perspective of an academic who is trying to get his papers published, all right? So this is going to, what you'll see in my presentations is a different perspective, and the perspective may look a little bit more like your own perspective. So try to keep these different perspectives in mind when you write your papers for publication. So the topic is, of course, of the workshop is academic writing for international publication. And today's presentation is going to cover three topics. The first is, what do reviewers look for in research papers? And you heard some of this from Dr. Paul Kratoska yesterday. He gave you the editorial picture. I'm going to give you the picture of a reviewer. So I've been invited many times to review papers for journals. In fact, right now I'm reviewing 2 papers for journals, and I'm also reviewing 2 other papers for this workshop. So what do reviewers look for in research papers? The second part of this presentation is going to be responding to referee reports. So once you submit your paper to a journal, if they decide to review it, they will have it reviewed by experts in the field who will write down all their comments, and then those reports will be sent back to you. Well, what do you do when you get a report? And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about choosing the right journal. And all of these will come from my own perspective and my experience as somebody who's just like you, who's anxious to get the papers. My reputation, my career depends on it. I think for most of the people in the room, it's probably the same. And then finally, we'll be open for a question and answer session. I will try to keep these modules relatively short, maybe 20 to 25 minutes. We'll take a short break in between. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have at least half an hour, maybe 45 minutes, maybe an hour to respond to questions and answers. Okay, so the first part of my presentation is about what do reviewers look for. Well, if you remember yesterday's presentation, and for those of you who are new, one of the things that Dr. Kratoska said is when an editor receives a paper for his or her journal, the first question he or she asks is, who is going to read this paper, right? So editors are looking for readers. And so the first thing to remember is, in order to get published, what do you as an author need to do? You need to convince the editor, first and foremost, that if he or she publishes your paper, a lot of people are going to want to read it, okay? Now, how do you do that? Well, very broadly, the first thing you need to think about is who are the readers who are going to read your paper, who are going to be interested in your paper. Okay, so you need to write for a specific audience, and you need to keep that audience in mind, and you need to understand when you're picking a journal who the audience of the journal is. And you want to make sure that the people for whom you wrote your paper are the kinds of people who read that journal. I'll come back to that a little bit later in this presentation. So you want to pick journals or publishers that serve the audience for whom you have written your paper. Okay, and then as a bonus, if you can write a paper that interests a wider audience, not just the regular people who read that journal, but perhaps the people of a country or people in a whole profession, then the journal editor may be even more interested in your paper, because that will give the journal the opportunity to get exposure not only within its regular audience, but within a much larger group of readers. Okay, and editors are always looking for more readers. Okay, so what do journal, now if that's what editors look for, they're looking for readers, right? Then what do journal reviewers look for? Well, journal reviewers, they get their instructions from the editor. Okay, so when the editor tells a reviewer, please review this paper for my journal, and here are the criteria, those criteria, you must understand, are criteria that ultimately aim to get a good readership for the journal. Okay, so what are some of the criteria? Well, the first criterion, and it's one of the three most important criteria, is significance. Okay, now what does significance mean? It means two things. The first thing that the significance of your research means is your topic important? All right, if I'm writing a paper that focuses on a very small part of the world, and whatever I'm finding does not have any generalizability, I cannot generalize it to a larger area, and maybe the question is not a pressing question of the day, then the topic is probably not that important. All right. If on the other hand, you are writing about a topic that many people will be interested in, even though you're looking at one place, there are some principles, some findings that you can generalize to other locations or into other disciplines, then I think it is more likely that the editor and the reviewers will consider your work to be significant. Okay. So one of the things you must do in your paper is you must emphasize why your work is important. Okay, everybody is busy, you are busy, I'm busy, I don't have a lot of time to read all the papers that come on my desk. You have to be able to write the paper to convince me that of all the papers that come on my desk, 50, 60, whatever it is, I'm going to pick yours and read it, right? You have to convince me that it is important enough that I will spare some of my time to read your paper and not the 50 other papers that come on my desk. Okay, so that's the first part of significance. Is the topic important? The second part of significance, which is also really important, is does your paper advance the state of knowledge? Okay, and this is something Dr. Kratoska mentioned briefly yesterday, but I want to emphasize it. Okay, in other words, we know things, right? We already come into our professions knowing things. With our training, we learn a few things, right? What is your paper doing outside of what we already know that will make it worth my while to pick it up and read it? Okay, so does the paper advance the state of knowledge? And the subtext, the text behind that is, will people get something out of reading it? Okay, it needs to be worth their while to pick it up so that they learn something new. All right. The second criterion that is extremely important is innovation. Okay, innovation is basically what is new. What are you doing that is new? What are you doing that nobody else maybe thought of, right? So there are different ways in which your paper can be innovative. Your paper can be innovative because it studies a new topic, a completely new topic. Okay, so maybe you went, you were doing research in the jungles of, let's say, Borneo, and you discovered a new species of a bird, right? Well, that's new. Nobody knew that this bird existed. You found it, you described it, you said it is this big, it makes this kind of song, these are its nesting habits, this is what it eats. All right, that is a substantively and a topically new piece of research. Okay, That is highly innovative. So if you make a discovery, okay, and for many of us, the real joy of doing research is finding new things, right? It's like finding a buried treasure. You want to be able to communicate to the editor and to the reviewers that you found a buried treasure. You need to show them that it is treasure, and you need to show them that it was buried. Nobody else knew it before you found it. Okay, that's innovation. Another way in which you can innovate is methodologically. All right. So one area is substantively. Substantively means there's a new question or a new body of knowledge that you're providing. A second way is methodologically. So maybe you are asking a similar question to what has been asked before, but you're answering it using a different method, using a different way. And maybe you'll find results that confirm what other people knew. Maybe you'll find results that contradict what people knew. Maybe you'll find a mix. Some of it confirms what people knew, some of it adds something new. All right. So methodologically is another way to innovate. One way to think about it is maybe everybody has done research using qualitative methods. All right. And now you come in and you have some statistical data with which you can ask the same questions and answer them. Right. So you use statistical methods to answer the same questions. And in the process, maybe you discover some new things. So that is one example of methodological innovation. All right. And of course, if you can convince the editor and reviewers that you're doing both, you're doing something substantively new and you're doing something methodologically new, well, then your paper is probably even more innovative than other papers that maybe just do one or the other. All right. So keep in mind, innovation, you have significance, right? Is your question important? And then the other question is, what is new? What are you doing to create new bodies of knowledge? I'll say one other thing. I've reviewed many papers now for journals. And a lot of the papers ask significant questions, but they are not very innovative. All right. And other papers ask significant questions and they are innovative. Okay. And the papers that I enjoy reviewing the most are the ones that are innovative. Because if an author can write a paper in which he leaves the reviewer thinking, I wish I had thought of that. This is really brilliant. This is totally new, right? Then you are in a very good place in regard to the review process. There's a very good chance the reviewer will say, this is fantastic. This is new. Maybe there are some problems with other parts of the paper, but because this is innovative, I want to help this author get the paper published. All right. Okay. A third aspect, and this is extremely important also, is your approach. Okay. So does the paper use robust, solid, established methods to answer the central question or questions? Okay. Now, if you're in anthropology, let's say cultural anthropology, maybe ethnographic methods are the way that you do it. If you're in economics, almost surely it's going to be statistical methods, or if you're doing something theoretically, it's going to be proving theorems or lemmas or something of that nature, something more mathematical in nature. All right. It doesn't matter which discipline you are in. Make sure that the methods that you use to answer your question are state of the art. They are what the latest research shows is the best way to answer questions of the kind you're asking. And you need to deploy them, and you need to make it very clear to the reviewer that you are using state of the art methods. Okay. Now it's even better, as I said, if you innovate on those methods and you have some methodological innovation, that's even better. But at the very least, you must use robust methods to answer your central questions. Okay. And then the second part of the approach is, are the data that you're using appropriate for answering your central questions? Right. So in other words, if I'm doing a statistical analysis and I collect some numbers reflecting some variables, I want to make sure that the variable captures the concept that I'm trying to test. All right. If you're an ethnographic researcher, right, and you're doing research, let's say on culture and religion in Java, you want to make sure that the people that you interview or the communities within which you spend your time to do your ethnographic research are communities which can help you shed light on these questions connecting culture and religion. All right. So in both cases, people are going to look and they're going to make sure that the data that you're using, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, aligns with the questions that you're asking. All right. They convey the information that you claim you need in order to answer your questions. All right. So let me now talk about my experience. I'll give you some tips to make the review process a positive one. Okay. So these are tips for a positive review process. Number one, when you write your paper, keep in mind that the person whose voice is the most important in determining whether your paper gets published is the reviewer's voice. Okay. There's a reason journal editors need reviewers. Journal editors often do not have the expertise to review a particular paper. And almost always they do not have the time. They are extremely busy people. So they hand out the paper to somebody who is understood to be an expert in the area. Okay. Now you can imagine that reviewers are very busy people too. All right. This is something Dr. Kratoska said yesterday. He said, look, you send a paper to somebody to review. They've got 100 other things to do. They're doing this on a volunteer basis. They're probably not going to prioritize the review above a dozen other things that are much more urgent for them to do. Okay, so reviewers are very busy people. All right. And very often they say, yes, I will review this paper, when they have no expectation or no idea whether it will be worth their time to read the paper. They may end up wasting their time for 2 or 3 or 4 hours reading the paper in order to give an evaluation. Okay. So remember, when you submit your paper, it is going to a person who does not have a lot of time. Okay. And you need to do everything you can to make it easy for the reviewer to write a review of your paper. All right. Now, what are the criteria on the basis of which your paper will be reviewed? Remember, significance, is it important, and does it advance the state of the knowledge? Innovation, what's new? Something new substantively or methodologically? And do you use robust methods, and are your data appropriate? These are probably the 3 most important things: significance, innovation, approach. All right. So when you write your paper, make it easy for the reviewer to answer those 3 questions. All right. Because the editor is going to ask the reviewer, is this an important question? Right? Will it be, in other words, will it be of interest to my readers? Is it innovative? What's new? All right. And did you do a good job methodologically in using your data? Okay. You want to write your paper in such a way that when a reviewer opens it, they can easily find the answers to the questions about significance, innovation, and approach. All right. Now, how do you do that? One of the first things you need to do is you need to make the presentation of your paper excellent. Not good, not very good. It needs to be excellent. Okay. It needs to be something that when the reviewer prints it out or pulls it up on the computer, they look at it and say, this is really clearly, this person made an effort to make this paper easy to read and a pleasure to read. Okay. So no typographic errors. All right. No misprints. Your font needs to be a good font. It needs to be uniform throughout the paper. Your headings, maybe you put them in bold font so people can see where one section starts and the next section starts and so on. All right. Your grammar and spelling need to be perfect. Okay. Because the reviewer, unfortunately, doesn't even know who you are. If you're submitting your paper to a good journal, it's a blind review. All they see is good grammar and good spelling, or bad grammar and bad spelling. All right. And even if you are even if English is not your first language, the reviewer has no way of telling. All they see is your paper. Okay. So your grammar and spelling need to be perfect. You have to find a way, whatever that way is, to make your grammar and spelling perfect. Okay. Good is not good enough. All right. Tidy and attractive formatting. Okay. When I open a paper and it looks nice, I want to read it. If I open a paper and, maybe the vertical spacing of the lines is not uniform, or, the indenting is not uniform, or the headings are, not in bold face or something like that, and it's hard for me to figure out where to go to find the data, where to go to look at the methods, where to understand what your conclusions are. That becomes a problem, okay? So make your paper, format it in a tidy manner, and make it attractive. Make the reviewer say, wow, I want to read this paper. It actually looks like this person put a lot of time and effort into writing it, okay? Now, on the flip side, on the opposite side of that, if you don't do these things, you can get into some trouble with the reviewer, okay? And this happens to me all the time. Not all reviewers are like me, but I know what I do when I review a paper. And if I see a paper with a lot of spelling mistakes and grammar, I stop trying to read what you're trying to tell me. I'm starting to fix your spelling issues. Okay, so I'm going to each word, making sure it's spelled correctly. And then I get to the end of the paragraph and I don't understand what you were saying in the paragraph because I was busy fixing your typos, right? So you want to make sure that the reviewer is not distracted away from your research by all of these problems: typographic errors, grammar, spelling, formatting problems, okay? Make sure that they focus on your ideas, and the way to do it is to get rid of all these other little issues, all these distractions, okay? The other reason it's a problem is it wastes the reviewer's time, all right? And believe me, a lot of reviewers, as I said, they're very busy people. The last thing you want to do to a reviewer is make them feel like they're wasting their time, okay? You want to make them feel like, I read this paper and I got something out of it, okay? I learned something new, and I wish I had the ideas that you, the author, had. You know, they're such good ideas. I wish I had thought of them, all right? That's how you want the reviewer to feel when they're done, when they're finished with reviewing your paper. All right, make it interesting, okay? Convince the reviewer that the paper is interesting and innovative, all right? And for this reason, there are 3 parts of the paper that I think are particularly important, okay? The first is the abstract and the introduction, all right? Why is the abstract and the introduction important? Because this is usually the first thing a reviewer will read, all right? And in English, there's a saying, and I'm almost 100% sure in Bahasa Indonesia, there's a similar saying: the first impression is the last impression, all right? The first impression that somebody gets of a paper is going to last for a very long time. You want to make sure that your abstract and your introduction tell the story to the reviewer in a way that they say, okay, now I know what to expect and I know what to look for in the paper, okay? The second part of the paper that is extremely important is the conclusion, okay? Because it tells the reviewer what she or he hopefully got from the paper, okay? If you have a conclusion that says, in conclusion, such and such, I found this, I used these data, this is what's new about it, and this is why it's significant, then you have already made it easy for the reviewer to start writing that referee report, to start writing the report and say, this is what they got from it, this is how they did it, and this is what is new. These are the questions that the editor is asking them to answer: significance, innovation, and approach, okay? And then another part of the paper that I think is very important is the reference section, all right? And the reason it's important is, of course, when you write a paper, you have to situate your own ideas within the larger literature. Of course, that's very important. But another thing that the references do is that they show the reviewer what you know. Do you know what other people have done in this area? And they also show the reviewer that you know, okay? So your reference section is a way of telling the reviewer, I know this subject, I'm an expert, okay? And I want you to be very confident that I'm an expert, because I know that if you understand that I'm an expert, you will take my paper more seriously, all right? So it's a very quick way to show the reviewer that you know and what you know. And in general, if the journal does not limit the number of references, more is usually better, okay? Show them that you know more. The worst that they'll do is they'll come back to you and say, look, you put in too many references, can you get rid of some, right? Now, in health journals, they actually limit the number of references. So the American Journal of Public Health, I have a paper that's just coming out in it. They have a limit, 40, and they don't want you to go above. And if you submit a paper references, They send it back saying, take some references out. We have a limit of 40. Okay, so keep that in mind. But generally, if a journal does not limit the number of references, more is usually better. Okay, and I think we've come to 7:30. So I've done 20 to 25 minutes. I'll stop there. We'll take maybe a 5-minute break and we'll come back and we'll go to the next part.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Chandra. Now we will have a 5 minutes break. And for you who would like to ask questions, please put your questions in the Q&A on your screen. We will be back in 5 minutes. Thank you. Dr. Chandra, are you ready for the next session?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Dr. Chandra, the floor is yours.
Terima kasih, Dr. Ika Nurayani. So we're now going into the second module of this presentation. This one may be a little bit longer than the earlier one. And then the third module is going to be relatively short, all right? So let's move on now and let's talk about responding to referee reports. So you submitted your paper to the journal. The editor said, this paper is good enough that I want to take it to my reviewers and I want them to give you referee reports. Okay. So the reviewers get your paper, they read it, and they write all their comments down and send it back to the editor. Now, what is the editor going to do? Well, let's think about it. What is the purpose of the referee report? It is to give the editor advice on whether the paper is fit for publication. All right. And that's a very important function for the journal, but for you, not so much. What is much more important for you is the feedback that you're going to get to improve your paper. Okay. For you, the most important part of a referee report is the content of the referee report and what it can do to improve the quality of your research. Right. So whenever I submit a paper to a journal, my first hope is to get good referee reports. Of course, I hope that it'll get accepted for publication, but sometimes when you write your research, you don't know what the drawbacks, what the shortcomings of the research are. If you did, you would have taken care of them in your paper, right? So the most important thing for me when I write a paper and get a referee report is what feedback am I getting that can make my research better, okay? Whether or not it's accepted in the journal to which I submitted it. Okay. So what are the purposes of a referee report? Number one, to advise the editor. Number two, feedback to improve my paper. And sometimes the referee process actually results in an academic exchange in which both parties learn. And you get into a conversation with somebody else who usually is also very knowledgeable about your field. Okay. And this is really a wonderful aspect of the referee process when you start exchanging ideas and learning from each other. So keep your minds open to these functions of a referee report. They go beyond advising the editor. They're about academic exchange as well. Now, once the referee submits the referee report to the editor, usually the referee will give the editor a recommendation. And the recommendations fall into three broad categories. And then sometimes journals have, other categories within this as well. What are the categories? This is a great paper, accept it. Okay. This is extremely rare. If you submit a paper to a good journal, it is extremely rare that the journal will accept your paper on the first try. Very rare. You heard from Dr. Kratoska yesterday, the American Political Science Review. I think 0% of the papers that were submitted were accepted on the first try, right? The ones that ultimately got accepted were first sent back with requests for revision. The best journals very rarely will accept a paper on the first submission. Okay. The second category after accept, so when you submit a paper, do not expect that the journal is going to say, wow, we accept your paper as it is. Very rare. All right. The second category is revise and resubmit. So this is when the editor sends your paper to the reviewer. The reviewer says, this is pretty good, but here are some areas in which the paper needs to be fixed, right? This is a much more common occurrence, all right, than a direct accept. And then the third category is reject. And of course, in the really good journals, the very best, the most selective journals, this is quite common, okay? You submit your paper, either the editor looks at it and immediately says, I'm not even going to send it to my reviewers, or the editor sends it to the reviewers, gets reports, and the reviewers say, not good enough for this journal, all right? So that's also common. And then there are many other in-between categories. So some journals have a reject and resubmit. Some have a minor revisions and resubmit. Some have major revisions and resubmit. Some have reject, but if you think you can do something, send it back after 6 months or within 6 months. There are all kinds of other in-between categories. But these are the three broad categories: accept, revise and resubmit, and reject. The most important point I want to make here is you are very unlikely to get an accept from a good international journal on your first try. All right? Most likely you will get a reject or a revise and resubmit. So understand that if you get a revise and resubmit, this is very good news. It means the editor is keeping the door open to publishing your paper. Even if the comments in the reviews are, oh my gosh, look at this, you need to fix this, you need to fix that, you need to do this, you need to do that. They're not trying to be nasty to you. Do not take it personally. This is about trying to fix your research. The editor has opened the door and said, if you fix your research, I may publish your paper. Okay? So when I get a revise and resubmit from a good journal, a really good journal, I celebrate. I say, hooray, the door is open. Let's go in, let's clean it up, and let's try to get it published. All right? If you get a reject, again, if you get referee reports along with your reject, that's great. And if the referee reports are full of material, they are rich, they're not one-line referee reports saying, I don't like this paper, but they actually tell you why, that's also excellent. It's an opportunity for you to improve your work, to make it better, so that when you submit it to the next journal, the editor and the reviewers say, revise and resubmit. All right? So keep in mind, revise and resubmit is great news at a top journal. And reject is not necessarily bad news. 80%, 90% of the papers to the Journal of Asian Studies get rejected. Okay? You're with 90% of academics if you get a rejection from the Journal of Asian Studies. And a lot of them are really good academics. So it's not necessarily a bad place to be either. All right, let's move on. So how do you address a referee report? And here, different scholars have different approaches. So I think the best I can do is tell you what approach I take. And that's what I'm going to do in the next few slides. And I'm going to show you an example as well. All right. So different scholars have different approaches. And what is the implication of this? A lot of you in the room today are relatively junior scholars, right? Ask your senior colleagues who have been successful in publishing, how do you deal with a referee report? Okay. When you get a referee report that says revise and resubmit or reject, right? Go to your senior colleagues who have been successful in publishing and say, how do I handle this? All right. Take their advice. They've done it many, many times. They know how this is done. Okay. You don't need to learn from your own mistakes if you can learn from the mistakes of other people who have been there before you. All right. So let me tell you my approach. The most important part of your approach, I think, is your attitude. All right. If you have a good attitude, you will increase the likelihood that this will be a happy process for you. And my attitude always is the referee is trying to help. Okay. This is a busy person. They probably did not even want to read my paper when they got it. They're doing it because they feel they owe something to the journal. They owe something to the profession. All right. But they took the time. They have many years of expertise. They're now putting it down on paper to help me improve my research. Okay. So even if the review, even if the referee report is highly critical, they don't say one good thing about your paper. It's all bad, 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 bad. Okay. They are still trying to help. And what you need to do is you need to look for feedback that will help you improve your paper. Okay. So when I get a referee report, the first thing I do, or 2 or 3 or 4 referee reports, right? Sometimes your paper goes to many reviewers. I look for feedback that will help me improve my paper. Okay. Because at the end of the day, when the paper is published, whether it's this journal or some other journal, it has my name on it. Okay. And when people read my papers, I want them to think, yes, he does good research. Okay. Because reputation is extremely important in our profession. So look for feedback that will help me. I look for feedback that will help me improve my paper. And I read the referee report right in the beginning. I read it at least 2 times. And I go to sleep. I don't do anything that day. I just go to sleep, let my mind process it. And I think about the comments. Okay. So the first most important thing is your approach and your attitude. Understand that this is all for your benefit in the long run. And then look for how you can make it benefit you. All right. So responding to a referee report, what do I do? Again, I'm telling you my process. I create a document with the comments of the referee, right? I identify the comments in the referee report to which I need to respond, right? Sometimes the referee will say, here's a fact, and therefore, have you thought about this? Well, here's a fact. I don't need to respond to the fact. The referee stated a fact. But when the referee says, here's what I think you need to do about it, I need to respond to that. Because the referee is saying, I think you need to take some action here, right? And either I can agree with the referee or I can disagree with the referee. And I have to figure out what to do, okay? So I identify the comments to which I need to respond, and I try to respond, not even try, I always respond to every comment, okay? And what I'm doing when I respond to every comment is I'm telling the referee, I respect that you have taken the time to read my paper. You probably didn't want to do this. You probably had other more important things to do. You've taken the time to read my paper. You have shared your expertise with me. I am taking your comments seriously, okay? And I'm going to respond to every one of them. I don't want you to feel that I'm ignoring the fact that you have tried to help me improve my research, okay? So this is more than just the content of the paper. This is signaling to the referee and having a conversation with them and saying, you read this, you were serious about it, so am I, here are my responses. Then what do? Below each comment, I enter a response, okay? And what I usually do is I mark it with a little arrow symbol, and then I write my response. So here's an example. If there's a comment in the paper saying, change the word minus to plus, maybe I made a mistake, I wrote the wrong symbol, right? Below it, I'll write with an arrow, I've changed the minus to the plus. Thank you for catching that. That was a typo. I didn't see it. Thank you. You've helped me make my paper a better paper. All right. And then what you want to do is when I do this, I go into the manuscript immediately and I make that change in the manuscript. So here I'm replying in my document to the referee's comment, and then I'm going into my paper, okay, and I'm actually changing the paper to reflect that I did this. Okay, so I have two documents. I have the document with the comments of the referee, and in that, one by one, I'm replying to the comments. And then I'm going into the manuscript and I'm editing the manuscript to reflect that. All right. So how do I respond to a referee report? Some basic principles. Take every comment seriously. There's a reason the referee has written every comment. Okay. Regardless of the decision of the journal, reject or revise, right? Be grateful. People, experts in the field, have volunteered their time to help you out, okay? They are doing you a big favor here. You need to be very grateful for the time and effort that your referees have put in. Busy expert has taken the time to help you by giving you free feedback. You don't even have to pay for this, okay? They're helping your career for nothing. All right. Respond as a result, respond politely. It doesn't hurt, right? Say thank you. If they make a good point, tell them, I think this is a great point, right? And if they give you a point with which you don't agree, try to be a little bit kind to them, okay? Don't say, I disagree, you're wrong, right? You can say, while I see your point, I see the point you're trying to make, I'm unable to make the change for whatever reason, okay? Or I feel this way, not this way, and this is why, okay? So be kind. Be kind to your reviewers. Even if the reviewers, sometimes you get nasty reviewers and they're unkind. Be kind back to them. It costs you nothing. It can only benefit you. All right. So I'm going to give you an example now, and I'll need to move back and forth between screens. So this is a paper I wrote on the 1918 influenza pandemic. It was published in the journal Population Studies, which is considered to be one of the good demography journals. So this is the study of demography and populations, okay? I'll just give you a little bit of information about some of the documents I'm going to show you and then how I worked with them, okay? So first, I submitted this paper and I got an original referee report that was 6 pages long. And there were 3 referees. There was a referee A, C, and D, and they all wrote comments in that original referee report. And there was a fourth reviewer, a fourth referee, who actually took my document, and in Adobe Acrobat, he actually marked up the document with comments and with some editing as well, copy editing, which is great. And so I got all of those reviews, and I wrote a response, and I didn't realize it until I was preparing this presentation. My response was 15 pages long, okay? I responded to every comment of all four of the reviewers, and when I look back, that document was 15 pages long, all right? And then what happened? The journal replied with a one-page document, and I'm going to show you all of these documents. And then finally, in that reply, they said, basically, you fixed everything. There are a few minor things left. We're going to publish your paper. And then finally, the paper was published online. So let me do this. Let me actually go. I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to share another screen with you to show you what happened in this whole process. And I think I'm also going to paste the link to the paper, because I think this paper, even though Population Studies is a closed access journal, it's a subscription only journal, I think they made this paper open access. I don't remember, but maybe it's open access. So just a moment, yeah, bear with me. All right. So we'll go to, I'll just paste the link for this paper in, let's see. Yeah, I think it is unlocked. So I'm going to paste this. Buneta, can I paste it in the chat box?
Yes, you should be able to.
Sure.
Okay. So I don't know if you can check, Bella or Buneta, whether it's an open access paper, whether you can download the PDF. But that is the final paper. It's the link to the final paper. Now let me go to the referee reports and let me open them up. So the first referee report that I'm going to show you, and by the way, I took the permission of the journal first before showing you this, because this material is considered to be confidential material. All right. So this is a paper on the influenza pandemic of 1918. It happened about 100 years ago in Indonesia. I focused on Java, right? And what did the referee report say? I'm just going to quickly page through this to give you an idea about some of the kinds of comments. So usually a referee report will contain a summary of the paper, first and foremost, right? So this is reviewer A, and reviewer A basically says that prior to this, there's been one frequently cited estimate of how many people died from the pandemic in Java, in Indonesia. This was Brown, 1987. And then what this paper does is it uses data from the census of the Dutch East Indies to calculate how many people were lost during the pandemic, right? So he's summarizing the paper. And then, okay, now look at the comments, all right? This section lacks a general introduction to the epidemiology of the pandemic in Indonesia. When did it start and end? Did multiple waves occur? How many were believed to have been infected? These are many basic questions that I did not include in the introduction, okay? So that's a lot. That's a big comment. The reviewer should be informed on how Brown in 1987, who calculated that early estimate, how did he come to the conclusion that 1.5 million people died in Indonesia, right? And it turns out in that chapter that Brown wrote, there was no explanation of it. So I'm going to show you what I did in my response to the referee report. Why are the results presented in the literature review section? Okay, that's a mistake I made. I should not have done that. I should have put them in the results section. Okay, these are very basic mistakes. But I mentioned what I did in the literature review is I actually mentioned some of the results. He said, don't do that. Send it somewhere else. Data section, they want to clarify something. That's easy to do. Okay, some questions about the language, right? It's unclear. Some of your language is unclear. Results section, okay? You've calculated a decline in population, but it may have to do with, a number of other factors that you're not considering, all right? Then they're talking about some other material, some other literature, that perhaps I need to engage with. All right. More problems with the interpretation. Okay. Here, think about some other works. Cite some other works that you may want to engage with and cite in your paper. All right. And then some other I mean, these are a lot of comments, right? And I hope you can imagine now that if I were to start thinking about all of these comments and to write my paper, to engage with these literatures and comments, it would become a much better paper. Because somebody like this reviewer obviously knows things that I didn't know when I was writing the paper, right? And presumably, if this reviewer, who probably is a subscriber to this journal and probably a good demographer, if this reviewer is like everybody else, I want to make sure that my paper actually engages in these kinds of conversations. Okay, but you can see just one reviewer has given me all this amazing feedback. All right, there's a lot I can do to improve the paper. Okay, the second reviewer actually took my document, took the paper and marked it up in PDF, and I'll show it to you in a moment, right? The third reviewer, nice things to say to begin with. This is a good paper. This is what they've done. The findings are relevant and should contribute to our knowledge. So this is nice. It's nice to read this. Okay. But, okay, nevertheless, I have a couple of comments that need attention, particularly in relation to the discussion of the findings, okay? And then here are some papers you may want to consider looking at that are connected to your research. So more engagement with the literature, more opportunities to engage with the literature. All right. Reviewer D, interesting paper, but how did you do your stuff? How did you interpret the stuff? So on, and then some specific comments on different pages. Okay. And then finally, this is what the editor says. While all 4 reviewers found the paper interesting, there was general agreement it does not show adequate familiarity with the relevant literature. Okay. So in other words, remember what I told you about references. Show what you know and show that you know. Okay. It turns out, I should tell you, just so you all know, that I did know about some of this research. I just decided not to include it in the paper because I felt that what was in the paper was enough to give reviewers an idea of what it was about. I didn't know all of these papers, but I knew some of them. I just hadn't cited them, okay? And now what the editor is saying is, you need to engage with these papers and you probably need to cite some, if not all of them, all right? And then some general comments about how to fix up your paper. All right. I'm now going to move to that reviewer B, who actually took the PDF document and made some edits in it. So give me just a moment. All right, let's share this screen. Okay, so this is the paper that was submitted to the journal Population Studies. And look at what this reviewer has done. This reviewer has actually taken the time to help me with editing the paper. All right, remove this, remove this. Here's a comment, okay? Look at another paper for some of the explanations why this reviewer is making the comment. More editing down here. Small edit, okay? But every one of these is a contribution to the paper. It makes it better, right? Now you can disagree with it and say, no, I'm not going to remove that phrase or I'm not going to remove that paragraph. My general approach is to, if the reviewer is suggesting something and I do not strongly disagree with it, there can be many reasons, I just do it, okay? Because they are looking at my paper through different eyes. Those eyes are probably as knowledgeable, maybe more knowledgeable, as experienced, maybe more experienced than mine. They probably improve the paper in some way, even if I don't see it, right? But so long as I don't disagree with it, I'm going to make the change. Because in somebody's eyes, it is making the paper a better paper. All right? Okay. So having shown you the reviews and what they look like, let me now go to my response. Okay. So remember, the document that I got was 6 pages long. Right? Now I'm going to go to my responses to the reports. And what you'll see here down here on the lower left side of the screen, this is a 15-page document, right? So first I wrote an introductory paragraph saying the four reviews they sent me. This is amazing, okay? This is like, if you want somebody to help you make your paper, it's like a workshop, right? These people are all helping me make the paper better. The 4 reviews contain very helpful comments. The paper was modified to reflect all of the comments, and thank you. You know, this is really helpful, all right? I'm deeply grateful for the significant combined efforts of the reviewers to enrich and tighten up the analysis and discussion in the paper. You're helping me. When this gets published, it's going to be so much better than what I submitted earlier. All right? Okay. So now here are my responses. And this goes back to my earlier slide. Okay. So they've summarized my paper. I have no disagreement. Thank you. Okay. However, there are several obstacles in accepting the paper in the present form, right? What is my response? These are addressed as per responses of the comments of the 4 reviewers below, all right? Over here. And then every single comment. Here's a comment, here's an arrow, and here's my response, all right? Now, what do I say here? I've included a general introduction to the epidemiology of the pandemic in Indonesia. You told me it wasn't there. Now it's there. All right. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. 15 pages will take us a very long time. All right. But I just want to give you an idea about how to deal with this process. Okay. Every single comment has a response. Every single comment. Okay. Sometimes 2 or 3 reviewers say the same thing. Then I just copy what I wrote for the first reviewer into the response for the second reviewer. I don't say go back, go above and see what I wrote for this earlier reviewer. That makes it hard for them. I want to make it easy for them. I paste the same response there. Okay. All right. Good. Look at this. Good point. Okay. When they make a good point, tell them, thank you. You know, I'm going to do this. This is a great idea. All right. Okay. And sometimes you have to say no, but you have to say it nicely. Okay. How can you be so sure that, you know, something happened? Well, I used the word likely. I didn't say I'm 100% sure. I said likely to convey that I am speculating. So in this case, I'm not making any changes. Okay. My response to your comment is, I think I already took care of that. Right. And here's why. All right. So where are we in terms of time? We are at 8:03. So let me stop the share. And then let's see. So I've shown you the referee reports. I've shown you my responses, 15 pages. Okay. Now, what I want you to appreciate here is it took me a long time to respond to those referee reports. Okay. You must never take referee reports lightly. Give them their due. 4 people. Each person probably spent at least 2 hours reading my paper and then commenting on it. That is 8 hours of experts working on my paper. Okay. The least I can do is give them up to 8 hours back. It turns out it probably took me about 8 hours to respond, right? To prepare all those responses and to clean up the paper. But that's what you need to do to get your paper published, to make it better, to make it good enough that the editor says, yeah, I want to publish the paper. Okay. And finally, let me show you the journal's response. So this is the journal's response to the edits. Okay. 1 page, right? Report of reviewer B. Okay, now you can still do a few minor things. You've cited a paper, but it's not in your references. Maybe you need to do that too. Of course, you need to do that. Okay. Reviewer C. I think that the authors have addressed my previous inquiries well and that this paper should be accepted for publication. And the editor. Okay. We welcome the careful attention the author has paid to the reviewer's comments. All right. on the previous version. We have only the following additional points to make. This is all basic. This is like standard stuff. Check your references, make sure they're accurate. There's one substantive issue you need to fix. And then, of course, you put somebody else's map in your paper. You need to get copyright clearance. All right. And then this is standard language. Here's what you need to do to tables and figures. Okay. But this is one page now. And they're saying you've basically done everything the reviewer said. Thank you for paying attention. Let me give you one other very important perspective here. This is not my perspective as a writer. This is the perspective of the editor. Think about what the editor did during this process. He went to 4 people, 4 demographers, and said, listen, can you give me some of your time? They're not paid. Can you volunteer some of your valuable time to look at this paper? Okay. Now, if the editor does that every day, if the editor of a journal comes to me every day and says, can you review this paper? Can you review this paper? Can you review this paper? At some point, I'm going to get fed up and say, listen, I've got other things to do, right? I'll review maybe 1 or 2 or 3 papers for a journal in a year because there are other journals I review for, right? So the editor, when he approaches a reviewer, he is burning some of his social capital, right? He's kind of using goodwill to get this feedback. He did it with 4 people, all right? This is costly for the editor, okay? You want to keep that in mind. The editor is really doing you a big favor by sending your paper out to be reviewed by 4 experts. And you need to be grateful for that. You need to understand that. And you need for that to come through in everything you do to respond to the journal. Take it seriously, okay? Because editors, the reviewing for them is very costly. They have relationships. They're kind of cashing in on those relationships, if you will, in a way. All right. So I'm going to stop the share. Let's go back to the example. So feel free to take a look at the final paper. That's what came out as a result of all of these referee reports. And we'll take a 5-minute break. And then we'll come back to the session on choosing the right journal. And this will be a shorter session. Let's see, do we need to, let's see, I think, did I share it? Let me share it. So the next session will be a shorter one. I think yesterday there were many questions that we were unable to answer because there wasn't enough time. So I've shortened this last section to give plenty of time for questions and answers.
Before we have our break, let us give our virtual applause for Dr. Chandra. So now we come to our second break. We will have 5 minutes for the break, then we will come back with choosing the right journal from our distinguished speaker, Dr. Chandra.
Buneta, Bella, how's the sound? Is everything okay?
Yeah, everything's perfect. There was a question on whether if you show more documents that you can zoom in so that the Microsoft document text could look bigger, but the audience can also use the full screen mode. Silakan gunakan full screen mode when there's a PowerPoint or Microsoft document that's being shown. That would help with the size and visual comfort. Thank you.
Okay, so maybe should we start at 8:15?
Yeah,
Yes.
I guess 8:15 will be great. Yeah, so, sorry.
8:15, yeah?
Yeah.
Let's start at 8:15. Yeah.
See you.
So, we will start in 8:15.
Bella, that is a really good point about the full screen. Would you mind letting some of the audience, in case some of them can't really find the function?
Okay.
So itu dia ada di atas ya, Bapak dan Ibu. Mungkin Bella bisa menjelaskan lebih lanjut. Kalau ada yang ingin curious, ingin tahu.
Ya, kalau misalnya dokumen yang sedang di-share screen oleh Pak Siddharth kurang bisa terbaca ataupun PowerPoint, bisa menggunakan full screen, ada di sebelah kanan atas, di pilihan view, ada beberapa menu di sana, ada standard, side-by-side speaker, side-by-side gallery, lalu ada juga yang paling bawah adalah full screen. Jadi kalau diklik full screen mungkin tampilan langsung lebih penuh karena full screen, mungkin lebih gampang dibaca. Silahkan dicoba. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Ibu Bella.
Mohon maaf Bu Bella, suara saya cukup jelas ya Bu. Tidak ada gangguan ya Bu.
So far sih cukup jelas Bu Ika. Memang kadang-kadang at the beginning atau at the end bisa ada kayak ini gitu gangguan sedikit, tapi so far so far so good.
Jadi ini tadi ada beberapa pesan dari Mas Anas kalau Mas Anas akan paste beberapa questions dari YouTube ke webinar chat gitu. Ini sudah ada satu yang di paste.
Ya, betul Bu.
Di Google Sheet yang saya share, Bu Ika, semua juga tertampung di sana. Jadi satu tampilan kalau bisa membantu Bu Ika.
Baik ya, terima kasih.
Kami copas-copas ke sana juga.
Bisa lihat ya Bu Ika yang chatnya juga, atau Q&A, atau Google Sheet.
Ya, jelas sekali. Mungkin nanti akan saya kupas dulu yang di Q&A, kemudian saya akan ke Google Sheet, apakah itu cukup?
Kalau sudah di Q&A, Bu, mungkin langsung dari Q&A ke chat saja, karena di chat itu pertanyaan yang dari YouTube, jadi mungkin Google Sheet-nya berarti tidak usah dibuka, karena Google Sheet seluruh pertanyaan. Jadi mungkin Q&A dan chat aja, Bu. Saya lihat memang di chat ada 2 kalau tidak salah. Saya lihat satu, maaf. 1 pertanyaan. Di Q&A banyak.
Oh iya, betul. Menanyakan, ya.
Dari Ibu Nina Nurmila ini, Bella, yes, I know how to see the screen in full. Jadi Bu Ika dan Bu Bella, but the document is just so small. Jadi PPT-nya clear, tapi tidak dokumen yang versi Word.
Ya, mungkin karena apa tadi kami sudah pesankan Pak Siddharth kalau ada doc lagi mungkin bisa sedikit di zoom in.
Baik.
Sedikit di zoom in mungkin layarnya. Kalau dari kami, kalau dari Mbak Neta sama Ibu Ika, apakah tulisan yang kecil? Saya sih bisa terbaca.
Saya juga, dari saya juga terbaca dengan jelas. Ya.
Jelas.
Kemudian juga ada komen, ini saya bacakan saja. Untuk Professor Chandra, to slowly show the reviewer's comments and how he responded to those comments. Menurut beliau, too fast saat di scrolling untuk ditunjukkan. Jadi mungkin nanti sebelum Profesor Siddharth kembali memulai acara, mungkin ya Ibu Ika, bila berkenan, disebutkan mengenai 2 komen tadi, yaitu Word document tampilannya lebih kecil. Kemudian WA to slowly show the reviewers' comments and how we responded to those comments.
Right. So Dr. Chandra is back. Before we start, I'd like to pass on the comments on your presentation. So far, the audience enjoyed the insights that you gave them. There are comments on the technical sides of the presentation. So first, the audience asked if you could share the files, mostly the referees' comments slowly, because some of the audience could not really read what was on the screen because it was too fast. And then the second one, a few from the audience, they could not see clearly the Word file that you shared on screen. So it appeared to them that they could not see half of the Word file that you shared. Okay, so those are some of the technical comments from.
Yes. So should I show the documents now? Would people like to see them again and I can zoom in?
I guess that would be.
Why don't we do that very quickly and then we'll come to the third part of the presentation, yeah?
Thank you, Siddharth.
So, yeah, it's difficult because for me, they're in front of the screen. So
Yeah.
Let's go to the share again. And the first document that I'll share is the original referee reports. Okay. And in my screen, I only see, I don't see the whole page. If I want to see the whole page, I have to zoom out, but then it's too small for you. So let me zoom in and make it as big as I can. Is this readable to people?
Yeah. I think we can read it.
Yeah, Dibacha?
Bisa.
Okay. So this is the referee report. My intention was not for you to read every word in the whole referee report. It was just to explain, what does the referee report look like, and what are some of the comments that they are making in the referee report. So these kinds of things. So this paragraph that I'm highlighting is the summary. Every referee report should contain a summary of your paper that demonstrates that the reviewer understands what your paper is about. And then they'll go into their comments. So this comment, is it okay now? Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes, Siddharth, on our end.
Okay. So here's a comment that says, where's your introduction? I had an introduction. It just wasn't a very good introduction, obviously. So they're saying, listen, you need to do a better job with your introduction. Okay. Another comment was, you talk about the work of Brown, and he estimated that 1.5 million people died in Indonesia in 1918 from the influenza pandemic. How did he calculate that number? You didn't tell us in your paper, but you need to tell us. Okay. And so on. So now there are many comments, and unfortunately there are 6 pages, so I can't show you all the comments. I'm just trying to give you an example of, here are some comments, and then now I'll show you how I responded to them. So we'll do a screen share. And these are the responses. So I'm going to go to the top. Whenever you respond, start by saying thank you, because people are volunteering their time to help you. Okay. So this is my first sentence is always thank you. And what did I do? I'm telling you that I paid attention to your comments and I modified my paper to reflect all your comments, every single one. Okay. And thank you. Okay. Now let me go to those two specific comments and show you how I responded to them. Remember the comment that you lack a your paper lacks a general introduction? This was the first comment I highlighted in the referee report. Okay, what have I done? A general introduction to the epidemiology of the pandemic is now included. All right? With information on the timing and duration of the epidemic, the presence of multiple waves, and the phenomenon of cross-immunization. The question of age-specific mortality is one that cannot be definitively addressed on account of the lack of good data on the subject. They asked, in the referee report, he said, can you tell me about the ages, right? What is the age pattern? I'm sorry, I don't have data on the age. The Dutch East Indies government did not report data on the age of people who were dying from the influenza, okay? So this is my response. Second one, you mentioned that Ian Brown had 1.5 million deaths in his paper. Where did he get the number from? How? That's the comment. The answer is, unfortunately, when you look at the figure, the number, it is presented without reference to a source or a method. And then I said, look, I looked in other places to try to find out where he got that number from. I couldn't find it. Therefore, it is not possible to describe the method or the source that was used to come up with the number. Okay? The number, whatever its source, remains important because it's widely cited. So in Brown's paper, there are 1.5 million deaths. We don't know where it came from, but everybody's citing the paper and saying 1.5 million deaths. Okay, that's my response. So I apologize for those of you who are expecting me to go through all of this. I cannot, but I just wanted to give you an example of how to handle a reviewer's comments. Yeah. Okay. Is that good, Ibu Ikanurayani? Is that sufficient for now?
Yes, yeah. I think it gives the audience about what they should do to respond to the reviewers. So
Yes.
we thank you very much for going through again some of these files.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I apologize to everybody. It's a little bit difficult working with these documents and conveying them on Zooms. All right, let's go back to the presentation then. Choosing the right journal, right? And I'm going to give you again the perspective of somebody who wants to get published, right? What do I do when I'm trying to find the right journal for my paper? Okay. All right, so I use two criteria. They are broad criteria. There's a lot that goes on within these criteria, but the two criteria are fit. How does my paper fit with the journal, and how does the journal fit with my paper? And quality. Okay, is it a good journal? What do these mean? So first, are my paper and the journal a good fit? Chochok, yeah? Are they a good fit for each other? So one thing that you need to look at is the subject matter of your paper. Is the subject of your paper the kind of thing that the journal publishes? This is something that Dr. Kratoska mentioned yesterday. He's coming from the editor's side. So when he looks at papers, he's looking for fit as well, right? Well, how do you figure that out? One of the first things you should do is go to the journal web page. Okay, some journals are broadly focused, some are narrowly focused. Okay, some journals want theory, some want data, some have a geographical focus. The Journal of Asian Studies is about Asia. The Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, as Dr. Kratoska said yesterday, is about Southeast Asia. Don't send him papers, don't send that journal a paper on Bangladesh, if you remember his example from yesterday. Okay. A second indicator, none of these are not rules, these are guidelines. A second indicator is to look at the references in your paper. Maybe you cited 45 papers, right? Where did those papers come from, right? Did they come, do you see 2 or 3 papers that came from a journal, a particular journal? If so, maybe that journal is a good fit. Maybe the readers of that journal who read those papers may also want to read your paper because it's connected to them, okay? But remember, this is not a necessary criterion. I've submitted many papers to many journals without citing anything from that journal. Okay, look at the subject matter, look at the references. These are not rules, these are guidelines. A third criterion for me increasingly now, as I become a little more senior in the profession, is with whom do I want to have a conversation? When you publish a paper, you are trying to have a conversation with people, with the readers, and with other scholars in the field. Okay, so you want to think about who are the readers who are going to read it, and are they the people with whom you want to have a conversation? All right, I'll give you an example. The paper that I just showed you in population studies, the journal is a journal of demography. I could have sent the paper to a journal on Indonesia, right? But I had to ask myself the question, do I want to have a conversation with people who are interested in Indonesia or with people who are interested in demography, right? I chose demography because I wanted to convey the message that Indonesia is a very important country demographically. It is the fourth biggest country in the world. And if you want to think about the global influenza pandemic and its impact on the populations of the world, you cannot ignore Indonesia. We need an accurate estimate. Okay. And so for me, the motivation for submitting that paper to population studies and not a journal about Indonesia was to tell the world of demography, if you want to think about a pandemic and you want to think about the cost in terms of human life, you cannot ignore Indonesia. All right. Okay, so with whom do you want to have a conversation? In this case, my answer was I want to have a conversation with demographers. I also want to have a conversation with Indonesianists, but I cannot send the same paper to two different journals. Okay, and then you want to look at the culture of the journal. And what I mean is when you start looking at a journal and its content, it gives you an idea about how the people who write for that journal and how the editor and how the people who read that journal, how they think, what is their perspective. One very simple way of thinking about culture, but there are many other ways, is in terms of the methods and the data that they use. You have qualitative journals, you have quantitative journals, okay? My paper on the influenza pandemic in Indonesia was a kind of a quantitative paper. If I had sent it to an area studies journal that was mostly qualitative, it would not have been a good fit with the culture of the qualitative journal. That was another reason I sent this paper to a demography journal, because demography is a quantitative discipline, right? And sometimes you want to think about the disciplinary or ideological emphasis, right? If there's a journal about Marxist studies, you probably don't want to send papers on, capitalism and, free markets and so on, unless you can somehow connect it with, concepts in Marxism, right? So this is the first thing that I look for. Does my article fit the journal to which I'm submitting it? And if not, can I find a journal that is a better fit? Okay. The second issue is the journal a high quality journal, right? Now, RISTEK BRIN has already made a statement about what it views to be measures of quality. Okay. Now, of course, those are not the only measures of quality. And sitting in the US and many international scholars they look at multiple indicators of quality, not just one indicator. So here's what I do when I'm trying to figure out the quality of a journal. I often go to colleagues in the profession, my research community, professors who work in demography and health and on Indonesia and on economic history, right? And I ask them, is this a prestigious journal? Is it a good journal? Is it a journal you would publish in? Okay. Is it efficient? To me, quality also means efficiency. If I send a paper to this journal, am I going to hear back in a month or 2 or 3? Or am I going to have to wait for 2 years? And if the answer is you're going to have to wait for 2 years, I don't bother sending the paper to a journal. Recently, I sent a paper to a journal. I thought it was a good journal. Okay. 2 months later, they had not yet sent it out for review. Okay. What did I do? I wrote to them, I said, I'm withdrawing my paper. Okay. I didn't say it in an angry or nasty way. I said, I'm just writing to let you know that I'm withdrawing my paper for consideration from your journal. Finished. Sent it to another journal, quickly reviewed and published. All right. So is it efficient? That's important. It's more important for you in your early stages of your career, because for you, there are many things like promotions and so on that depend on this. So if a journal treats you badly and is taking a long time, you need to know that. And you need to think about whether you want to send your paper to that journal. Okay. So is the journal efficient? Is the journal prestigious? Does it use double-blind review? For me, this is extremely important. Okay. When I review papers, I don't want to know who wrote the paper. I want to judge the paper on what is in the paper. Okay. So does it use double-blind review? Does this mean that the reviewer does not know who the author is and the author does not know who the reviewer is? To me, that is an extremely important characteristic of a journal. Okay. And then I ask my colleagues, does the journal provide thoughtful reviews? Okay. This is one of the most valuable things you can get out of this whole process, is thoughtful reviews. You saw those reviews I got for that paper, right? 4 reviewers, 6 pages, plus my whole manuscript was marked up. That's really amazing. And this is one reason why I will continue to send papers to that journal. Okay. I know that they will help me make my paper a better paper, right? So these are some questions that I ask my colleagues, okay, because a lot of them have had experiences with these journals and they give me advice. The second thing is reputation, okay? And reputation usually rests on 2 or 3 criteria. For me, a very important one is selectivity. What percentage of the papers that are submitted to the journal end up getting published, okay? And selectivity right now is not a part of any of these other indices. Impact factor, citation, all that stuff, it's not part of it, okay? But selectivity is important because selectivity is very difficult to manipulate, okay? Some of these other metrics about citations, you heard from Dr. Kratoska yesterday, people start citing each other, their friends. I think when I was in Indonesia, I was at a seminar, somebody used the word citation mafia, okay? So there are ways that people can actually engineer these things. Selectivity is much harder because selectivity, if a journal is selective, what the signal that you're getting is a lot of people want to publish there, but they cannot accept all of those papers, okay? And that is often the mark of quality. It's demand. It's the market saying, we like this journal, I want to get my paper there. It's good for my reputation. It's good for conversations with scholars, okay? Metrics, you heard about some of these. Impact factor, Google Scholar rankings were not mentioned yesterday. I'll show you these in a moment. The Social Science Citation Index, the Science Citation Index from the Web of Science. Simago, this is also available on the web. So these metrics are also useful. And when I'm submitting papers to a journal, I take a look at these as well, okay? And then finally, reputation among scholars. What do scholars say? Okay, this is tied to asking your research community who are scholars, is the journal prestigious? Is this a good journal? Okay, now let me just show you some of these. So how many of you, most of you know impact factor, right? You know what it is. Maybe you have access to the Web of Science, the journal citation reports that come out in the Web of Science. Is available on the internet. You can get it immediately. To me, there are some problems with Simago. One is that when you look at journals, they often put journals that are not in the field. They put it into that field. Okay. So I can actually, maybe I can show you an example of that as well. But let me go to the internet now and let me show you a few ways in which I try to gauge the quality of a journal. Yeah. So I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to start up my browser. Okay. And we'll open up a new window. And let's see. Here we are. Yeah, for those of you who are Indonesia, di sini hari ini hari pemilu ya, hari Jadi pemilu yang terpenting. So that's why they have all of this on Google over here. You probably don't have it in Indonesia because you don't have a pemilu right now. But let me go to, let me show you Google Scholar, scholar.google.com. You can go to metrics. This is a place where you can get an idea about journals as well. It's another source of information. It's publicly available. Okay. You can choose categories. All right. So for example, I go to, let's say, health and medical science. So I publish in the area of public health, subcategories, public health. Okay. This will give you, this is another way using H5 indices of ranking papers, right, journals, right? So this is one ranking of these journals. So here's the American Journal of Public Health, right? So when I got a revise and resubmit from them, I was very happy. I don't need an accept, just keep the door open for me. I'm very happy, right? But here you can see the rankings according to Google Scholar, right? You can then go maybe to another site and type in, let's say, ranking journals, public health. Let's see what happens, right? The first site that you hit is Simago, which I mentioned on my slide, right? You click on that. And here is your ranking of journals in public health. And what you'll see here is it's a little bit different. This is a very specialized journal. It's not really a public health journal, right? There may be 1 or 2 or 3 papers that cover public health, but it's mostly clinical microbiology, right? If I was writing a paper about public health, let's say on COVID-19 or the 1918 influenza pandemic, I would not send my paper to clinical microbiology reviews. I'm a social scientist. I'm not a lab scientist. But the Lancet Public Health is in fact a public health journal, okay? So it is, in my book, this would be the top ranked, according to Simago, this would be the top ranked real public health journal in this list, all right? So when I'm looking for measures of quality, this is what I do. I go to Google Scholar, I go to Simago, I go to the Social Science Citation Index, I go to the Science Citation Index, right? I look at impact factor, and then I ask my colleagues, and then I look at the journal website itself and see if it is a good fit in terms of the culture of the journal. And then I put all of this information together and I come up with a list of maybe 3, maybe 4 journals to which I'm going to send the paper. I usually start at the top and then I work my way down. So this is something Dr. Kratoska mentioned yesterday, the step process, right? It's always advantageous to start with the best and then to move down. That way you're sure that you do not underplace your paper. You don't send it to a journal that was perhaps lower in some metric or the other than one in which you could have got published, right? Okay, so let me stop that share and go back to the presentation, right? And let's activate this. And here we are. I finished the 3rd module, and I think we are now in Pertanyaan dan Jawaban part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Chandra. And Ibu Ika, if you... Thank you, Ibu. Saya serahkan kembali kepada Ibu Ika. Terima kasih banyak, Profesor Chandra.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your valuable insights, Dr. Chandra, on the on how to respond to the reference, and then we also learn a lot about which journal we can choose. And now let us start with the question and answer session. First, I will to see what is inside the Q&A. So we will start first with Bu Rosa from from UNESA, yeah, about in terms of significance and innovation, when a study is conducted in Indonesian context and the paper wants to be published in international journal, for instance, US journal, how do we make a paper more advanced or more significant for international readers? So, Dr. Chandra, Bruce?
So the question is, how do you make a paper more advanced for an international journal?
Yes.
So I'll give you my opinion of Indonesian research. When I first came to, and this may sound a little bit political, when I first came to Indonesia, it was in 1994. It was during Orde Baru. And and I'm a social scientist. And at that time, I think the political environment was not as open as it is today. And so I think as a result, the quality of research was perhaps not as engaged, as vibrant as it is today. So my first response is the quality of thinking written. I mean, there were good thinkers in Indonesia, there have always been. But now thinkers can freely express themselves. And the quality of social science research that I've seen in Indonesia since 1998, since 2000, in the last 20 years, is just amazing. People are arguing, they are exchanging ideas freely. They're talking about sometimes, tricky subjects, but freely. And so to me, the ideas are already there. I think the Indonesian scholarly community has some amazing ideas to share with the world. I think most of the problem lies in two areas. One is the international culture of communication. There is a way in which you communicate ideas. And the way in which you communicate ideas is you need to make sure that you're communicating your ideas in an objective manner. But you also need to take risks. You need to be able to say, here is a fact, here is another fact, here is another fact, objective in some way. And based on these facts, this is what we can infer and this is what we can conclude, right? But don't stop by just saying, here is a fact, here is a fact, and here is a fact. And I think sometimes there is a tendency among scholars in Indonesia to stop in a very safe place. This is a fact, this is a fact, this is a fact. I don't want to say anything more because once I go beyond that, I cannot go back and say somebody else said it. Well, we don't really want to hear what somebody else said. We want to hear the ideas of the scholar. We want to hear new ideas based on maybe what somebody else said, right? So how do you make your scholarship better? I think that the scholarship and the thought is already excellent. I think it is learning how to communicate it and how to write a good paper. And Paul and Susan Nerney will help you with that in other modules in the workshop. Paul Kratoska has given you an idea about what journals look for. Hopefully, I've helped you in the process of communicating with the journal and making sure that you get the significance and innovation and approach of your ideas across to the journal. I think a lot of it is that. It is really wonderful for me to compare scholarship in Indonesia today with the scholarship in Indonesia of 1994. Indonesia is light years ahead of where it was in 1994.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra, for answering the question from Burosa from UNESA Surabaya. And then the second question is from Pak Senoka Diansa. He would like to know if he can use Grammarly as the standard of good language checker.
The MLA?
So he wants to know if he can use Grammarly. This is
Grammarly.
Yes, as the standard of a good language.
So, we are still in the early stages of machine learning technology, right? And Grammarly and a lot of these other software-based applications, they are helpful, but they are still not ideal. They don't think like human beings. So I think that when you write a paper, it's okay to run it through Grammarly. Absolutely. You know, especially if you're not that confident about English because English is your second language. Yes, use Grammarly. But I don't think we are yet in a place where Grammarly is a substitute for a human being. And I think it's very important that you also share your work with a person who knows English, perhaps knows a little bit about your subject also, and can give you comments on how to tighten up your language. I don't know if you noticed in the referee reports I showed you, I'm a native English speaker, okay? And they were criticizing my English left and right, okay? So even if you feel like your English is good, you are going to be criticized on it. I have not, you know, I criticize papers that I review that I know are written by native English speakers. I say, you know, this seems like a problem. This is a problem. Are you using the correct language here, and so forth? Okay. So you really need your paper. I mentioned in the slide, it needs to be excellent. Don't stop at good. The English needs to be excellent before you submit it, because even then you're going to get comments on your language. Okay? Now let me make one suggestion. One of the things that we are hoping to do in AIFIS is connect Indonesian scholars with US-based scholars. Okay. I often collaborate with scholars. When I collaborate with scholars, I collaborate with them because I feel like they have something to contribute to the research that I do not have. They know something I don't know, right? Now, grammar is not a good enough reason to collaborate with a scholar. But if you feel that there is actual substantive research where somebody else who is a native English speaker can contribute, right? Where both of you can contribute intellectually, then there is a good chance that that native English speaker is also going to be your human who helps to fix the grammar. So there is an advantage, at least in this transitional stage in Indonesian higher education. There's an advantage to collaborating with native English speakers who have some ideas to contribute to your research as well. And we are hoping that we can help you facilitate some of these networks with the scholars here in the US. And if you find that there's complementarity in terms of ideas, well, you get the English for free as well. So it may be a second good reason to think about collaboration.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra, for answering the second question. And now we are in our third question from Ibu Novi Mardiana from Sangga Buana University. She asked, can you give examples on sentences to convince the reviewer on the significance of our article?
Can I give examples?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you know what? I wonder if I shouldn't pop up. Why don't I pop up that paper on Indonesia, yeah? On the 1918 pandemic. So just a moment. Let's see if it's still up. Yeah, here it is. I may have to zoom in, right? Do you see this?
Yes.
Are you able to read the abstract?
Yes.
Okay. So I want you to read the abstract and tell me what I did to convince the reviewers that this is a significant paper. Look at the first line. It was the 1918 pandemic was the single most lethal short-term epidemic of the 20th century. Okay, this is a big event. And by the way, it killed 50 million people. I don't know if you know that. Okay. Second, I'm going to talk about Indonesia. Why? Indonesia is the world's fourth most populous country. Okay. If you think that the pandemic was important because a lot of people died, you need to pay attention to Indonesia because Indonesia is important. A lot of people live there, right? And then I'm going to give you something new. The new estimates suggest that for Java alone, the population loss was in this range, 4 million, more than twice the established estimate of mortality for all of Indonesia. And the conclusion is we need to revise this number upwards significantly. And then finally, by the way, I'll also tell you a little bit about the geographic patterns of mortality and population loss across Java, across all the kabupaten, yeah, the regencies. So I hope that this example is sufficient, that do you see what I'm doing here? I'm trying to tell the editor and the reviewers, the pandemic is important, Indonesia is important. I'm going to show you something new and very different from what people have been thinking in the past. That's it. That's the abstract.
Yeah, I hope that answers Ibu Novi's question. Thank you, Dr. Chandra. And now we come to our fourth question from Professor Pujiati from Sumatera Utara. She asked the differences of perspectives between reviewers and researchers. So what are the differences between researchers and reviewers' point of view in the articles?
So that's a very good question. So the first point I want to make is that reviewers are researchers also. Yeah. But when we are reviewers, we are in a different role. Okay. When we are researchers, we are in search of ideas. We are producing knowledge. When we are reviewers, we are advisors to the journal editor, and we are engaged in a conversation with the researcher who's writing the paper. Okay. Now, what does that mean in terms of differences in point of view? The researcher is going around digging for treasure. The treasure is the new knowledge, right? What new things can I find? What exciting things can I find to share with everybody, right? You're hunting for treasure. The reviewer is checking to see how good that treasure really is. Is it treasure or is it trash? Okay. And the reviewer has to make the recommendation to the editor about whether this is treasure or is it something else. Okay. And in the process, they're going to tell you why they think it is treasure or not. And they're going to tell the editor why they think it is treasure or not. One last thing, Dr. Kratoska said this. He used the word adversarial, right? The review process is an adversarial process. I'm your adversary. I'm looking for reasons. I'm looking for holes in your research. I'm looking for weaknesses in your research. Because I know you are going to tell me that it's treasure. I want to provide the editor with unbiased advice about whether in fact it is treasure. Okay. So the process is adversarial. When I get a paper, I'm looking for problems. Right? Because I know that the writer, if the writer is a good writer, they've already told me what the good parts are. What are the problems? Okay. And if the good parts are good enough that they outweigh the problems, maybe there are no problems and it's good. Fantastic. Accept the paper. Maybe there are no problems. Maybe there are some problems, but there's enough treasure in there that if we polish it a little, it'll look really good. I'll recommend a revision, right? But if there are only problems and there really isn't a lot that's good, probably a rejection.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chandra, for the answers of our third question. And now we move to the fourth question. This is from Ibu Siti Rasat from Pajajaran. So she asked how many parameters. I'm very sure about this, but then I assume that she would like to ask what kind of a standard that we have to hold to send our articles to a reputable international journal.
What kind of standards? Is that the question?
Yeah, so what standard that we have to comply so that we can send our articles to a good international journal? You
know, it is very difficult. I would say even today's, I don't have a good judgment. I have some idea, but not a very good idea about standards. And the reason is I do my research because I enjoy it. I like it. I think it's good, right? But because it's my research, I don't have an objective perspective. It's my perspective. And it may be totally different from the perspective of other people. So what I recommend you do in looking for standards is look at journals. Look at good journals. Look at journals that are not supposed to be so good. And look at the difference in the papers, right? I think you'll find that in the good journals, generally there's a lot more effort into it that has been put into looking at the literature, at placing the paper within the literature. It is probably a highly innovative paper. If you read the paper carefully, you'll see, wow, this paper does make a big difference. It says something very new, right? And it probably says something that is important to a lot of people, especially in the research world, but potentially outside. Okay. And then if you start going below that, you reduce some of the, maybe this is not that important, or maybe it's only of interest to 35 people rather than 35 million people, right? Then you're looking at research that perhaps doesn't meet that standard. But the broad question of, what is the standard to get into a good journal is a very complicated question to answer. And I think the best way to try to think about it is to look at papers that get published in that good journal and see if your paper matches it. Okay. And the other thing you can do is send your paper to colleagues. Send your paper to people who are not biased. Like you are biased. This is your research. Send it to people who are not biased. Okay. And say, what do you think? I'm thinking of sending it to journal A or B or C. Which one do you think I should send it to? And very often that's an easy way for them to tell you, this is not that good. Maybe you should send it to journal B, not A, without saying it to you.
Right? Thank you again for the answers, Dr. Chandra. And now we move to the next question. This one is from Ibu Irawati from the Faculty of Law from UNPAD. So she asked about writing a paper on legal matters. She mentioned that it's difficult to write an article on legal issues because most of the time she only uses literature review. She did not include the aspect that you mentioned earlier on how to write a good article. So she would like to know how can we write a good article answering legal questions.
So I have to apologize. I'm not a scholar of legal questions. The closest that I come to looking at legal issues is through a social science perspective. Sometimes I look at the impact of a law on some kind of social scientific phenomenon. So I apologize, I cannot answer your question directly. But let me attempt to talk about reviews more generally, because this question came up yesterday, right? A review article. And maybe legal reviews are like that. So what is the function of a review article? By the way, review articles get cited a lot, right? They are often the articles in the social sciences that are the most highly cited. And the reason they are very highly cited is a review article is designed to give somebody in 10 or 20 or 30 pages an idea about an entire literature. Okay? And so it will contain a lot of citations, a lot of very important citations, and it's a very easy way for you as a scholar to learn at least a little bit about a whole literature in a relatively short amount of time. Okay. Now, review articles, what do? They are about telling you what has already been done on the subject, right? And then what do they do that is creative? What they do that is creative is they say, look, here is all the work, but here are 4 or 5 thematic areas that seem to be the most important within this body of work. Okay, so now they're telling you, here is one area that's important within this area, here's another area, here's another area, here's another area. these are the questions that people are paying the most attention to. And that is very valuable information for you as a scholar, because it can help guide you about what you can do your research on next, so as to have some relevance within this larger literature. And my suspicion is that a legal review probably does something similar. It probably takes all the decisions that have been made, all the opinions that have been written on a particular topic, and says, here are some important dimensions and characteristics within that. And the process of identifying those important dimensions and characteristics is creative. That is something you are doing. You are creating new knowledge by saying, here's 100 things. We all know about these 100 things. But within those 100, here are 15 that do this and 18 that do that. And here's how this is different from that. That is creative. So my suspicion is that's probably what legal reviews are trying to do in some way, shape, or form.
Thank you very much, Professor Siddharth. And we would like to welcome Dr. Paul Kratoska, just joined us. Welcome. Silakan, Ibu Ika. Thank you.
Welcome, Dr. Paul Kratoska. And now we will continue with the next question from Pak Arinaldi from UI. Yeah, that Dr. Chandra mentioned that an author should try to make the paper easy to read. Could you tell us about this more? Because this might be a bit difficult for a non-English spoken country, yeah, like Indonesia. Does it mean the paper should avoid difficult terms or sounds too scientific? So many readers who come from any disciplines could read the article. So that's the question from Pak Naldi from UI.
Yeah, so this is a very good question, and I think there are many ways to answer it. Let me start by saying, so making it easy to read, right? When a reviewer gets an article, chances are, as I mentioned, they have, and Dr. Kratoska said this yesterday, they have many other priorities in life, okay? And they have an article that they have to review, and they're doing it voluntarily. They're doing it for free. So this is going to take up some of their valuable time, right? So the reason you want to make it easy is you want the reviewer to feel like it's not as much of an effort as perhaps they thought it was going to be. You want it, and you want it to be a pleasurable process. You want your paper to be neatly presented. Ideally, you want it to be exciting and innovative. So the reviewer says, wait a minute, I thought I was just going to look for holes in this paper. No, I'm actually learning something new here. And I'm wishing that I had had this idea. It's so good, right? Now let's talk about the language and how to deal with that, right? So the question of jargon, right, using big words, etc., is an important one. And I think perhaps the best way to figure out how you should calibrate your language is by looking at the journal to which you are going to submit the paper, okay? If, for example, your journal is an interdisciplinary journal, that means that the readers, remember the editor is looking for readers. Dr. Kratoska emphasized this right at the beginning of his presentation yesterday, okay? If the editor is looking for readers and the readers are interdisciplinary, they do not want big specialized words from your discipline that they cannot understand because they come from a different discipline, okay? So use language that you see being used in the journal, the level of language and the type of language in which you want to publish. That is a very good indicator about what kind of language you should use. Now you'll find that if you go into some very specialized journals, the language does become, the words get bigger. They become more like words that people only in that field really understand well and nobody else does, right? And if you want to publish in one of those journals, calibrate your language accordingly. Speak the language of the readers, okay? And the best information about that is in the articles that the journal is publishing, okay? Now, if you are a second language speaker, as I said before, I'm sorry to say it, but you know, your English has to be excellent. Good is not good enough. I said this before, I'm a native English speaker. People are always correcting. I think I've written a great paper. My English is perfect. They're always correcting my English. They're saying, maybe you should change this word to this word. All right. And that is when the paper has already been written by a native English speaker. So one way or the other, however you do this, I cannot overemphasize the English has to be perfect. You have to find a way to do it. There are ways. You can use Grammarly to begin with, but it's not enough. You can, maybe your university has a native English speaker in the library or somewhere else who is a resource person who can read your paper. My university has that for our doctoral students, okay? Michigan State University has English language resource people. We're in a native English speaking country. We still do this, okay? And then the other strategy is maybe if you can collaborate with a native English speaker who has something intellectual to contribute, I think that's another way to get around the problem. And then finally, practice, practice, practice. The more you write, the better you get. You know, maybe today we have the internet. You can watch news broadcasts in English. You can get on the internet and practice your English. Try to do that. But absent, if your paper comes in and the English is not good, you are at an immediate disadvantage with the reviewer. Certainly a reviewer like me, because I start correcting spellings. I'm no longer focusing on the ideas. You know, I can't help it. That's how my brain works, you know.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Well, you're talking about a paper that's easy to read. And the thing that makes a paper easy is when the author goes from one idea, linking to the next idea, linking to the next idea. In other words, the paper has to make good sense. And if there's a paragraph about this, and then suddenly they're talking about something different, and there's no connection that you can see, that makes it very difficult. So it's not just a matter of language, but it's also the way you put the paper together. And I suggested yesterday something about headings. But actually one strategy you can use, I think I mentioned this too, is that you just look at your paper paragraph by paragraph and you say, okay, what is this paragraph about? And you might do this, some published articles that you find, and just take it apart that way. You just look at it and you say, okay, what is this paragraph? What is the topic of the paragraph? What is the author talking about here? Just write those down, 1 or 2 words. And then you can begin to see how the author has put that paper together. It's good practice for your own paper. It's good practice for reading other people's papers. So language is important, but also the way you put the paper together. And that helps the reader a lot. I don't think people should necessarily panic about this. I mean, small errors can be fixed. It's more the question of whether what you have said in the paper moves along and makes sense. I suspect most everybody listening to this will make little mistakes, and you know those are fixable. I mean, I'm a native speaker, and I can go through and okay, you've got the tense wrong, or you've got the agreement of the verb wrong. I knock the letter off, and it's fixed. So it's not hopeless. But if a paper comes in and the language is really terrible, then I look at that and say it's too much work to try and deal with that.
Okay, thank you for Dr. Chandra and Dr. Kratoska answering the question. And now we will continue with the next question from Ibu Esti Setiadi. She asks why good journals take a very long time to publish our articles.
I think Dr. Kratoska, having edited journals, you may be in a better position to, I think I have part of the answer, but you probably have a much better answer.
Journals will have a certain number of papers in each issue, and it depends how many papers they have waiting. Some publishers, not just journals, but some publishers actually have a plan that sometimes goes the entire coming year. Now, sometimes the paper that they think they're going to get doesn't work out and something can be moved up. But it depends a lot on the backlog. And over the years, there have been journals that have gotten, I guess you'd almost say they get in trouble because people say, well, I don't want to send my paper there because it takes too long. So no journal wants to be in that position. Unfortunately, what that means sometimes is if, let's say they have a lot of papers already lined up, they'll say, okay, we don't want to accept anymore for the time being because we don't want to make people wait that long. So it is one reason that sometimes a paper that's pretty good will actually be rejected.
Thank you, Dr. Kratoska, for the answer. And we will continue now with a question from Ibu Nining Ismiani. She asked here, which one is preferred, a research paper or a critical review paper? And how do we write a good critical paper? Do we need to discuss some articles to be reviewed or one reference is enough? So that's a question from Ibu Nining. Yeah, I will give the floor to Dr. Chandra or Dr. Kratoska.
Paul, do you want to take a crack at that?
The journals that I've worked with generally don't do critical reviews. So I haven't much experience with that. The one thing I would say though is that in my experience, you don't get very much credit for the critical review because, I mean, you were talking about this a little bit ago, that it's not your own work, it's other people's ideas. Primarily, and what you get credit for in the academic world is your work, your ideas. So I would maybe discourage you from putting a lot of time and effort into a critical review.
May I add something to that? I think here, Paul, it actually varies across disciplines. Mm. So if you look, for example, in the health sciences, at psychology, for example, psychologists actually rely very heavily on review articles to situate their papers when they're trying to publish a research paper, right? And so as a consequence, there's a journal called Psychological Reviews. You can look it up. It has a huge impact factor. And the reason is it is a journal that is exclusively devoted to review articles. And everybody seems to use it in the introduction or something of their paper to say, you know, this is what's been done in the field, and here's my area, and now let me write a research paper. So I think the tradition of reviews really varies across disciplines. In psychology, if you want a lot of citations and you want to get into a high impact journal, you go for a review journal. In economics, it's somewhere in the middle. The economics, probably the best known review journal is the Journal of Economic Perspectives. It is not considered to be as prestigious as the American Economic Review or, you know, one of the other sort of so-called top journals. And then I think in the humanities, I think it's even lower down in the food chain. So you have to remember which culture, which academic culture you are in determining whether you want to go for a review article.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. And now we will move to next question from Pak Emban Masud from the Faculty of Forestry from Hasanuddin University. He said that he would like to thank Dr. Chandra because of the wonderful learning opportunities. And then he asked, I would like to know more about the term interesting in your presentation. It's important because every one of us may think that our article is interesting. So that's the question.
So you know, I thank you for that, and thank you for your kind words. Interesting is a very subjective term. What you find interesting, I might find uninteresting. What I find interesting, you might find uninteresting, right? But I'll tell you, for me, based on my experience reviewing papers and reviewing grant applications, right? Sometimes you have a pile of papers or applications to review. And it's hard work And often it's not a lot of fun, you know. It's like going out and mowing the lawn or collecting the leaves, and and so it's a chore, right? What we call a chore in the US. And but 2 or 3 out of 10 articles that I get to review have something that is so new and so clearly innovative that nobody has thought of before, that it inspires me, right? So when I say interesting, it is something that inspires me and makes me wish I had an idea like that, right? So if you can somehow, and I don't think there's any formula for writing such things. I think that I can give you strategies for trying to be creative. I think one strategy is to learn many different things. So if you're a historian, go and read something in a totally different discipline that other historians are not reading, and try to connect them with what you do. That will probably be innovative, right? So to me, those are the things that are interesting, is you've done something that nobody else did, and I'm inspired and I wish I had done it. And usually that's putting 2 things together or 3 that nobody else has thought of doing. And one of the most effective ways to do it is to step outside the area in which everybody else in your field is working and bring something from the outside in. Because nobody else is doing that. Everybody is sitting in their own little corner, doing a little more incremental work. Go out, hop outside, bring something back in. Maybe you'll have something innovative.
Yeah. Can I add to that? When you do that, you also want to make sure that you highlight the thing that you have done. And that means you make sure it's in your abstract. You make sure that your title, if possible, suggests, okay, this is what I've come up with that's new and different and exciting. The other thing you can try, I mentioned preprint servers. What, of course, used to happen was that people would do a paper, they would send it around to a bunch of their friends and say, well, what do you think of this? And so you got some feedback that way. You could still do that. People in the same field, different universities, and does this seem exciting to you? Or you can maybe put it up on one of the preprint servers and see what kind of response you get that way.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra and Dr. Kratuska, for the answers. We now continue with the next question from Pak Nubertus Ribut Santoso from Atma Jaya, Yogyakarta. He asked how to deal with the reviewers having a different point of view with the author. Should the author follow what the reviewer suggested, or should the author stick to our point of view?
So I'll repeat what I said in my earlier slide. And this is my approach. It's personal. It depends on you. It depends on your personality. It depends on your subject. It depends on what the reviewer said, right? My approach is, if the reviewer's comment does not harm my paper, I accept it, right? Because it doesn't cost me anything to make a change that a reviewer suggested if, in my opinion, it doesn't make the paper worse. So to me, that's the threshold. And it is very rare for a reviewer to suggest something that's actually going to make your paper worse. To me, when I showed you those 4 referee reports, right? In fact, in that situation, I responded to every one of those comments, and maybe 1 or 2 I said, I think I've already taken care of this. But the other 48 or 50, I actually made changes, right? So that would be my approach, is if it doesn't hurt your paper, do it. And if it does hurt your paper, very nicely explain, why you're not going to do it. Be polite. These people have volunteered their precious time for you. Be nice to them. Say thank you in whatever way you can.
Okay, could I add to that? Okay, I'd say 2 things. One is, you do not have to accept something you don't agree with. So if the comment comes and this is not something you can accept, you probably will have to explain, if it's a major point, you have to explain to the editor why you don't accept it. But it's your paper, it's not the reviewer's paper and not the editor's paper. So you do have a choice to make there, and you can make that decision. The other thing to be careful about, sometimes a reviewer misunderstands something that you've said. And so anytime a reviewer comments on something, you look at that place in your paper and think, have I really explained this well enough? Because maybe the problem isn't the point you're making, it's the way you're making it. And so obviously the reviewer has somehow stumbled over what you said. Now, in some cases, it's simply that you didn't say it carefully enough. So you can go back and rewrite that section, and that may solve the problem.
Yeah, thank you again, Dr. Kratuska and Dr. Chandra. And now we move to the next question. This question is from Utami, and this discusses the same problem in that Ibu Arini Utami asks, are we accepted to accept all reviewer suggestions, or can we negotiate with the reviewers? Yeah, so,
well, I'll just say one thing very quickly. You are having a conversation with reviewers as well. And sometimes there is an element of negotiation, but I think the rest of the question we answered with the earlier one.
And of course, the negotiation is generally with the editor, not directly with the reviewer. I think an editor normally will tell you, these are the important points. These are the things we think you really need to pay attention to. And then there'll be some other points where the editor is likely to say, this is up to you.
Thank you for mentioning that, Paul, because let me add something that kind of triggered another thought. So sometimes what I do when I disagree with the reviewer is I explain my reasons, but I also say that I will leave it to the editor to make this determination. Because, you know, the reviewer sees things through the reviewer's eyes, which are not my eyes. The editor sees things through the editor's eyes, which are also not my eyes. I'm open to the possibility I may be completely missing something. And I'm happy if the editor, you know, says, actually, you should do this. They can become the judge between the reviewer. And the other thing you accomplish by doing that is you're not outright rejecting what the reviewer said. You're saying, look, there may be something I'm not seeing. Let the editor make the call.
Thank you again for the answers. And now we have another question again by Ibu Rosa from UNESA Surabaya. The first one has been answered earlier, and then the second question, could you share, according to your experience, what reasons that motivate us to publish a study with Indonesian context in international journals?
Sorry, what are the reasons?
So she would like to ask, according to your experience, what drives you to publish a journal using local context, for example, mortality in Indonesia, and then publish this study in international journal?
So I don't know if I'm interpreting the question correctly. So let me answer what I think is being asked. And that is, I think our colleague is saying that I'm writing on Indonesia. What is the motivation to publish in an international journal?
Yes, that would be the answer. Yes.
So at one level, the motivation is international journals give you better exposure, but I don't think that's the question. I think the question is, how can we motivate the publication of a paper on Indonesia in an international journal? I think you have to make the argument. Remember, the editor is looking for readers. We go back to Dr. Kratoska's first few slides, right? Well, if the editor is looking for readers and you say, I'm working on, you know, Tegal Rejo in Java, and that's, and these results are relevant to Tegal Rejo, but no other place, right? The editor is going to say, of an international journal is going to say, why don't you go find a journal in Tegal Rejo and publish it just for the people in Tegal Rejo village, right? So you have to convince the editor that what you are finding, even though it is in a local context, will be interesting to the editor's readers, right? Now, how do you do that? I think you have to somehow convince the readers, the reviewers, and the editor that your findings are generalizable. Yeah, I looked at Tegal Rejo, but this is a universal phenomenon. And therefore, you sitting in Australia or Singapore or wherever, India or wherever you are, should also be interested in my paper. So that's really how you do it if you write a locally contextualized paper. The other thing you can do is remember I mentioned methodological innovation, right? Maybe you study a local area, but the method that you're using is new, and anybody studying any village anywhere in the world can use, maybe it's a statistical method, can use that same statistical method to ask similar questions or even different questions in their little village, right? So that is also in some sense generalizable and may be of interest to the editor of the journal, especially if it's a technology journal.
Now, well, I talked a bit about this yesterday, but one of the things you probably want to do is look at similar studies, whatever the question is that you're dealing with in the Indonesian context. Try to find articles about other countries that deal with something along the same lines. And then you can say, well, what I found is the same, or it's similar, or it's different. And that whichever the answer is, it does give you something that you might start talking about.
Thank you very much. And if I may, Ibu Ika, as well as Professor Chandra and Dr. Kratoska, we are now at 9:27, and we still have a few more questions to go. It's your call to stop at 9:30, or perhaps we could extend it for the next 15 minutes, let's say. What do you think?
I can go until 10 o'clock.
Okay, sure. And if I may, Ibu Ika, I would just like to mention a couple of questions from our YouTube channels. So the first question is from Bapak Wawan Cahyadin from Universitas Halu Oleo in Sulawesi. The question is it true that making references to articles published on a target journal will be an advantage? If so, how many will suffice?
Who's the question for?
Either of you, both of you.
So let me go back and I'll give you my perspective as an author. When you're writing, what is the function of a reference, right? What is the role of references? References do a few different things. Number one, they allow you to position your idea within the larger literature. So what you're doing is you are conveying to the reader, look, here are different things that have already been done. Here is something important that has not yet been done, and I'm going to do it in my paper, right? So in order to do that, you need to refer to papers that give the reader an idea about what has been done, okay? The second thing that these references do is that they signal that you know that literature. You are signaling to the reviewer and to the editor that you know the subject and that you are an expert on the subject. And they want to think that they're publishing papers by experts, right? So there is a signaling that is going on as well. Now, if that's the case, let's now answer the question. Should all references we use in an article be from reputable journals? Well, it cannot hurt if all your references are from reputable journals, right? You can't go wrong. So I think the question becomes more one of how about making references to articles from journals with low accreditation? And I would say that if the article it's a trade-off between how relevant is the article for your subject, right? And the quality of the journal and the signal perhaps that it sends. So I think you really have to balance the two and think. In the research that I do, some of it is very focused. I don't have a choice. I have to cite things from journals that may not be as reputable, and I do that when they're closely connected. But otherwise, for the best part, I do reference articles from reputable journals. One last thing. Chances are, if all your references are from journals with low accreditation, it may even be a subject that reputable journals are not publishing on, and that therefore there's some kind of unwritten consensus is perhaps not a very important question. You want to think about that also. When you're writing your paper, if all the relevant references seem to be, the relevant papers seem to be being published in these journals that you don't want to publish in, maybe that topic is not considered significant enough to be one that's published in a reputable journal. Over to Paul.
Yeah, well, I'd say, I mean, information data is data, and it is good or not good, but it doesn't depend on where it appears. Where you get into differences is in the ability of the writer to analyze that data, to draw interpretations from it. And I would worry about lower ranked journals in that regard, because sometimes they're not carefully refereed. Yeah. There was a similar question. I'm not sure exactly how this question, what the goal was, but yesterday somebody was asking, is an editor impressed if you cite a lot of articles from that journal that you're sending it to? And I think the answer is no, that I never pay much attention to how many articles from my journal an author is citing. And if you're citing articles from my journal just for the sake of citing them, I think that's a mistake. It sounds like you're trying to flatter me somehow. Oh, your journal's so great. I also occasionally have gotten letters from authors starting off by saying something really flattering about the press or the journal, and don't do that. I mean, no editor is going to be impressed by this kind of false flattery.
Thank you, both of you. And Ibu Ika, if I may, one more question from our YouTube channel. This one is from Maria Yanita of the Research Center for Population of the Lembaga Ilmu Pengetahuan Indonesia. The question is, how important is cover letter to convince the editor and the reviewers? Or is the manuscript itself will be enough? Thank you.
I think it varies from journal to journal. I'll give you one example and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Kratoska, who's actually edited journals. But there's a journal, the American Journal of Public Health, right? In their instructions to authors, they say, please write a cover letter in which you answer 3 questions, right? And I forget exactly what those questions are, but I think they have to do with number 1, what is the significance of your paper? Why is it important? Number 2, I think what are the implications? And number 3, how does it fit within the literature? Something like that, right? And here's the important thing. They say, make sure these 3 answers combined fit within 250 words, okay? Now, why is the editor doing that? The editor is doing that because they get hundreds of submissions and they don't have a lot of time and they want to make a very quick decision about whether they should send the paper on for review, right? So in the American Journal of Public Health, if you submit a paper without that cover letter, it will be returned to you until you write that cover letter. But I'll pass it on to Dr. Kratoska now because I think there are differences in different disciplines.
Well, just a couple of things. I talked yesterday about preliminary letters of inquiry, and I think most journals don't want that. But when you're talking about the submission and the cover letter for the submission, that's a different matter. The only thing I would say is that the 3 points that you mentioned ought to appear in your abstract and in your opening paragraph as well. The fact that they're asking you to do this doesn't mean you're excused from making sure that they're part of the paper. And the second thing to say is that I think you're absolutely right as to why they're doing that. And it does mean that if you don't do that well, then they may not even look at the paper. They'll just say, this isn't satisfactory and it's rejected.
Thank you.
Let me do something
Go
very
ahead,
quickly, Buneta. Let me actually share
Sure,
this
absolutely.
screen with you. This is useful, and those of you who are in the audience, you may want to actually bookmark this page. But because what Dr. Kratoska said, I think suggests that this is important no matter where you're submitting your paper. So I don't know why it's off. Yeah, here we are. This is what the AJPH asked for. A cover letter. Oh, it's not 250, it's 150 words that addresses the following topics. A description of what the paper adds to the current knowledge base. Remember I said significance in my presentation? Basically, what is the significance of your paper? Particularly with respect to material previously published in AJPH, and if systematic reviews exist on the topic. This is in the health sciences, so systematic reviews are an important part of the literature. Number 2, the public health importance of the paper. This is a journal of public health. And number 3, one sentence summarizing the main message or messages of the paper. And you have 150 words.
Well, just to say something about that, a good abstract is probably 150 words. So I think fundamentally they're asking you to write an abstract of your paper. And could you put it back up again?
Yeah, I'm actually just posting the link to everybody. But these are very good guidelines for a cover letter for any journal then. Let's go back to sharing.
Okay, because I was... Okay, and oh yeah, the other point I was going to make was this thing about material previously published in this journal. And as I said yesterday, when you publish in a journal, send a paper to a journal, you're joining a conversation. And so essentially what they're saying there is you need to be aware of that conversation. And you need to think about how your material contributes to that discussion that's already ongoing. So if you can do that, it really helps you get published, but it has to be done carefully. So I don't know, just picture, let's say you have a bunch of people talking about football, and they're talking about something technical or about some particular team. So you come along, you start saying something about football, but it's not relevant to what they're talking about. And you're just going to get blank looks. Well, you know, sure, it's football, but that's not what we're talking about. And the same thing would apply here. You need to pay attention to the conversation that's going on, and you need to contribute to that conversation.
Okay, great, wonderful. And before I give the floor back to Ibu Ika with the questions from Q&A, I would just like to recite here one more question from our YouTube channel. This one is from Bapak Wawan Cahyadin, Universitas Halu Oleo, again from Sulawesi. So should all references we use in our article be from reputable journals? How about making references to articles from journals with low-level accreditation?
I think we just responded, no, to that?
Okay.
Yeah, I think maybe just following up with one quick point. The question is partly how do you rank these journals? How do you decide a journal is low? And I think the question that sometimes comes up, you have a journal with a low impact factor. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad journal, because some journals, think of this. If you have a scientific innovation, a really dramatic something that's really new in, I don't know, say physics, very few people are actually going to be reading that. But it could be something very important despite the fact it has a small number of readers. So I don't think you can just rely on the impact factor in deciding what's a good journal. It's more a question of what do people in the field respect.
That's true. Yeah, it's actually a follow-up question because the previous question is about making references to their article published on a target journal, whether that will be an advantage or not. Okay, great. Siddharth, you would like to add to that, or should I just, okay. Yes, Ibu Ika, please go ahead, and thanks for allowing me to mention a few questions from our YouTube channel. Thank you.
No problem, Ibu Neta. Now I'm going to ask a few questions, again from the YouTube channel, because I think this is important for the audience. Yeah. So Ibu Ani Marsianti from the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies UGM. She asked, how do we distinguish prestigious journal from the predatory ones?
I think, Paul, you're the expert.
Well, the simple thing is you have about 30,000 journals, a bit more than that, covered in Scopus and in the Clarivate Analytics citation indexes. So the Social Science Citation Index, the Arts and Humanities Citation Index, the Science Citation Index, the Emerging Sources Citation Index. And you can pretty well say that all those journals are reputable. There are some reputable journals that haven't made it in there, but increasingly it's difficult for a journal to survive if it isn't in a citation index. So the good journals are all either in them or making an effort to get into them. The citation indexes do a screening. And so if it's in those indexes, I think you're safe. Apart from that, I think the only thing to say is that there are some specialty journals that people in the field will know are good. They just haven't bothered. There's a classic example. I don't think Indonesia, the Cornell Journal, is in the citation indexes. And of course, it's a great journal. It's just I think fundamentally you'd say we are not playing the game. So there it is.
Let me add, as somebody who has actually published in the Journal of Indonesia, what my motivation is. So when I write papers for Indonesia, I'm not writing for impact factor. I'm not writing for SSCI. I'm not writing for any of that. I'm writing to have a conversation with readers who I know are going to read the paper.
Yeah.
I'm writing for the audience there. I know who reads it. And I want to share ideas and have a conversation with them.
Yeah, one of the things that used to happen was that young scholars would aim for the high prestige journals, maybe say Journal of Asian Studies. Older scholars who didn't really care so much anymore about building their CVs might very well publish in the Journal of Siam Society, Journal of the Malaysian branch, because that reached an audience that they wanted to talk to. These days, I think a lot of those journals are in the citation indexes anyway, so that distinction isn't so important.
Paul, are you calling me old?
I'm not talking about you at all. I'm talking about people.
Indonesia is not in the citation indices.
I'm talking about people who are my contemporaries. They're old.
Thank you for the answers, Chandra and Dr. Ratuska. And then next is from Ibu Irma Fitriani from UGM. So the question is, as I know, Science Direct is one of the prestigious journals and has a very good reputation. But why sometimes I find papers which are not really qualified, like, for example, plagiarism, and unclear discussion. That's the first question. And then the second question from Ibu Irma, is it safe to cite and refer to some open access journal that can be directly downloaded from the search engine? So those are the questions. Dr. Chandra and Dr. Kratoska, the floor is yours.
Ibu Ika Nuryani, could you repeat the second part of the question about open access journals?
Yeah, so Ibu Irma asked, is it safe to cite and refer to some journal, to some open access journal, which can be downloaded directly from the search engine? Yeah. So is it safe to do that?
I think it's safe to cite them. You need to use your judgment and look at try to get an idea of the quality of the publisher and the quality of the paper. You know, if the paper is a good paper, of course, it doesn't matter what journal. I think Dr. Kratoska said this. It doesn't matter what journal it got published in. If it's a good paper and it's relevant to your research, cite it.
There are directories of open access journals, and they tend to be a little bit selective. So if you're looking at an open access journal, you can find out if the journal is in the directory of open access journals, or if the publisher is part of there's also a directory of open access publishers. And I think the first question was something about papers that are not very good, that are in good journals, or in, was that the nature of the question? You were breaking up a little bit, but.
Yes, that's the question in that Ibu Irma asked why good journals like Science Direct have articles that are not very qualified, or articles that seem to be half plagiarized. Yeah, that's what Ibu Irma said.
Well, the selection process isn't perfect, and sometimes journals do publish articles that are also not perfect. But if it's a good journal, somebody has said to the editor, this is a good paper. So it's a matter of judgment sometimes.
Let me add one other comment, because this didn't come up, about open access journals. This is something I've noticed this year, because I've been publishing papers on the 1918 influenza pandemic. And right now we're going through a pandemic. And of course, people around the world are interested in the subject. And in a lot of countries, universities and the general public does not have access to journals that are behind a paywall, subscription journals. So one of the things that open access does is it allows people anywhere to access your research. And I noticed this in one particular case. There's a journal, BMC Infectious Diseases. It has an impact factor of 2.675, something like that. But it's open access. And I published one paper on the influenza pandemic there. And the amount of attention it has received in the media and other places is disproportionately larger than the attention that my other influenza papers that are behind a paywall have received in the public. So there are some benefits to open access as well. And if the research has been refereed, my paper was reviewed, I think it was well reviewed, then, you know, it's probably okay. The research is probably okay.
When open access began, there were quite a lot of dubious things on the web. Well, there still are, but university administrations were very suspicious about it. And particularly, well, first of all, the fact that it was free, and there was some sense in the universities that if something is worthwhile, somebody should be paying for it. And then, in fact, a lot of open access journals do ask authors to pay. And then the idea that you're paying somebody to publish your material, again, universities think this is very good, very bad practice. Now, in fact, it doesn't necessarily mean that anymore, but there are a lot of university administrators who still feel that way. So that's one issue. So far as the pandemic's concerned, apart from the open access material, there are apparently a lot of articles that are just, I suppose, basically on preprint servers. So they're coming out, they can be accessed and read, but they haven't been refereed. And I would assume some of them will be refereed, published in the normal way. But you do have to be a little bit careful about papers that have not been refereed.
Thank you, Dr. Kratoska and Dr. Chandra. And now, one more question from Ibu Chandra from School of Pharmacy, ITB, Bandung. She has two questions. The first one is, when we start to publish, should we choose the lowest journal rank? So, for example, starting from the Q3 journal, and then after that, move to higher journals? That's the first question. The second question are we allowed to send a paper to multiple journals at the same time? So that's the question. Dr. Chandra.
I know that Dr. Kratoska can answer the second question and third question very well and probably quickly. So let me respond to the first. I think as a young scholar, so you know, in our profession, reputation is extremely important. And reputation is built on the back of good research. And one indicator of the quality of research, it's not the only and it's not perfect, is the quality of the journals in which you publish, right? So I personally would advise a younger scholar who has a few years ahead of them in their position to go for the best possible journal. Start with the best, get a rejection, and then go down. Because if it's much worse to place your paper in a journal that is not the best that it could have got into than, start at the top and keep getting rejections till you find it. It's a matching process. Don't undersell your work. Start at the top and move your way down.
I partly disagree here because we were talking about this in the talk yesterday, but if you take the field of Asian studies and something like the Journal of Asian Studies, a lot of people would say, well, that's very, very high up. But the problem is they are overwhelmed with submissions, and the odds for anybody getting published in that journal are low. So I would agree that you want to go to a very good journal, but sometimes the absolute best journal in the field, the competition is intense. And even if you get in, it may take a very long time because some of these journals will send the paper for refereeing. It comes back. Can you fix it? You fix it. It goes back in. They circulate it again. This can take a long time. And as a young scholar, you have two things that you need to do. One is to get into good journals, but the second is not to have it take 10 years to get published. So there's a balance in there. So as for the question about submitting to more than one journal at one time, you can destroy your career by doing that. Do not do it. The thing that often happens is, especially if you're in a fairly small field, an editor takes the paper, looks at it, this is probably something we should referee. They send a note to a referee, and the referee writes back and says, funny, I just got an invitation to referee that paper for another journal. And the next thing that's likely to happen is that I will, if that happens to me, I will contact the editor of that journal and say, this person has sent it to at one time. And we'll probably both reject it because it's unethical to do that. So don't.
With a lot of journals on the submission page, you have to declare, and this is legal, that your paper is not under consideration at another journal.
Yep, absolutely. Now, the reason for that is each journal, when they start refereeing something, they are calling on people to volunteer their time, just what you were saying earlier on. And we have only a certain amount of capital with the reviewers. And so if we ask somebody to review, they agree to do it. And then they say, oh, it's a great paper. Yes, you should publish it. And then we have to go back to them and say, well, the author did this. Well, the reviewers wasted their time. And we don't want to have reviewers doing that. And it also would mean that if that same author sends another paper later on, we're going to look at that author and say, well, that author didn't behave properly. We just don't want to risk this. So you can damage yourself quite a lot.
Thank you very much. And if I may, again, request for time, Ibu Ika, we would like to welcome Professor Martin Hatch, Professor of Music, Ethnomusicology Emeritus from Cornell University. Thank you. And Professor Hatch has a great question for both of you. Can the panelists please comment on the effect that publications in scholarly journals can have on the development of transformative public policies? Are there some journals that have a more profound effect in those areas than others have? Let me know if you want me to repeat the question.
I think I can answer. I mean, as somebody who's published in, journals across disciplines, there are some journals that are much more policy oriented than others. There are some journals that have the word policy in their name, right? There's the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management, JPAM. I think the American Journal of Public Health is about public health, and it is read by people in the public health professions, and it is intended to inform and influence public policy. And then there are journals that are much less applied, if you will, and don't connect to the world of policy in the way that these journals do, right? So there's the Journal of Asian Studies is not directly related to policy. So yeah, I think there are some journals that are much more directly relevant to policy than others. But as somebody in the research professions, having published in different types of journals, I don't think that necessarily means that one type of knowledge is more or less valuable than the other. They're all very valuable. They're all, they all expand our horizons as human beings in different ways. And it's very difficult to judge whether one way is better or, than another. So.
Well, let me just tell a short story. Some years ago, I visited the director of a foundation in Washington. He was a friend of a friend. And we were chatting about University Press books. And he gestured over at the corner, and there was a big pile of books sitting there. And he said, all those are from university presses. And they're interesting books. They're useless to me. Because he said, in my job, I go to a meeting next week, and we're going to talk about what came out this week. University press books take a year to come out, and we're policy oriented. It's a totally different sort of research and different sort of understanding. And I think that is partly addressing the point that Marty's making, is that there are really sort of two, what should we call it, two aliran here. There's one that is the academic side, and they do take a long time. And then there's the one that is more policy oriented, and things go through very quickly.
Thank you very much. Silakan Ibu Ika.
Ya, ini waktunya tinggal 3 menit lagi. Apakah akan diteruskan Ibu Neta, Bapak Chandra, dan Pak Kratuska, ya? Jadi apakah akan diteruskan atau kita ambil satu pertanyaan lagi? So should we continue with one more question? Because we only have 3 minutes left, ya.
Silakan Ibu, satu pertanyaan lagi mungkin.
Baik, so I will take a question from the Q&A, which I think is very interesting. So this is about references from Ibu Rastesa, UNS Surakarta. Do we have to include up-to-date references, for example, from the last 5 years? Is there any limit of the number of references that we should put? That's the question. I will now give the floor to Dr. Chandra.
So we have to go back to the function of references, right? And the function of references, again, there are many functions, but the ones I mentioned are they help you to position your ideas within what is already known, and to demonstrate that there are some things that are not known that you are now going to shed some light on, right? Now, whether you need to cite recent papers or older papers to do that really depends on what question you're asking and who did the research on it and when, right? So if I'm doing historical research, I'm citing papers from the 19th century and the early 20th century when I write about the 1918 pandemic. But I also cite recent papers that are looking back at the pandemic, right? So number one is it really depends on your research and how you are positioning your ideas within what has been done. But number two, another function of citations is to show that you are expert in the literature. It's a communication function. It's show what you know and show that you know. And for that, I think it is important to cite at least some of the more recent literature to show that you are up to date on what is happening. Now, if there's no recent literature, obviously you don't have a choice. But if you do, you should cite some recent literature as well.
Well, let me tell another story here. I got an article a year or so back, and I noticed that the most recent reference cited in the most recent article or book cited in that was 2003. And I thought, I think I know what's going on here. So I looked that person up. And what year do you think that person got the PhD? Well, 2003. So what had happened was that how many years later, this person says, oh, maybe I can get a publication out of a chapter from my PhD, took it out, didn't update anything, and sent it off. This is not going to get you published. And the question is really relevance. And just throwing something into your citations because it's recent isn't going to do you any good. But omitting something that's recent will probably do you harm if it's relevant to your topic.
Thank you very much. I understand that Siddharth, in particular, you have a commitment, so we will have to end it here. And thank you very much again to both of you, Professor Chandra and Dr. Kratoska, and also to Ibu Dr. Ika Nurhayani for moderating the whole question and answer sessions, actually. I would just like to remind all the attendees for tomorrow's section, there are two sessions. The first one will begin at 6:30 in the evening. Jadi jam 6.30 sore akan dimulai waktu Indonesia Barat, dan topiknya adalah Review and Revision Strategies, Research Paper Introductions. Pembicaranya adalah Bapak Paul Nerni. Kemudian dilanjutkan dengan sesi kedua, Salient Features of Publishable Academic English oleh Ibu Susan Nerni. So we are looking forward to seeing all of you again tomorrow. Dan sekali lagi terima kasih, kami akan mengakhiri sampai saat ini.